The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Purpose of this hearing is to discuss the State Department's FY 2024 budget request and explore the myriad of challenges facing the United States and its diplomats around the globe. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Mr. Secretary, welcome. And we have no shortage of crises around the world for sure. And there's a lot to talk about. I believe that we are in a very dangerous period in history, the likes of which we have not seen since my father's war of World War II. After the debacle in the fall of Afghanistan, and we had a hearing on that, we saw our adversaries respond. We saw weakness, and we projected weakness, not strength. History proves when you project strength, you get peace, but when you project weakness, it does invite aggression and war. You only need to look back to Neville Chamberlain and Hitler, and really the course of time has proven that axiom. So I think we need to start projecting more strength and deterrence. We saw not too long after the fall of Afghanistan on satellite imagery, the Russian Federation moving towards Ukraine. It was never a question of if, it was a question of when with Mr. Putin. And I think from what he saw, he decided it was the time. And we saw the troop presence, and then we saw the invasion. And then we see Chairman Xi. Chairman Xi is threatening Taiwan as we speak. They both met just recently, as you know, in Moscow. I know you met with the foreign minister of China when you were at the Munich Security Conference, right after the spy balloon went over the United States, filming some of our most sensitive military nuclear sites. So this is an intense time, and we're starting to see this alliance not very similar in my judgment to what we saw in World War II. It's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Now Mr. Putin is begging Iran for weapons. He has the Iranian drones in Crimea. I want to get the weapons in there to take out those Iranian drones, but they don't have them because you won't give them to them. The longer range artillery to win. I don't want to see him bleed over the winter and spring. I want to see victory, not a drawn-out conflict that has no resolution in sight. The threat of communist China cannot be overstated. They are the #1 threat to long-term to our national security. It's why I introduced and passed the CHIPS Act to pull the supply chain of semiconductors out of Taiwan and China and make them here in the United States. But still, 90% of that advanced semiconductor manufacturing takes place in Taiwan. So when people ask, why is Taiwan important? Imagine if China invaded Taiwan tomorrow and controlled 90% of the global supply. We would be in a world of hurt. I personally think Chairman Xi is going to try to influence the election. If he fails, then I think Plan B will be a blockade and an invasion that will be on a scale that will make Ukraine look like a very small thing. A massive cyber attack. Taiwan is not prepared. We have no joint military exercises. The weapons I signed off on 3 years ago have yet to go into country. I don't understand why this takes so long. And if we don't have the deterrence, like we didn't have the deterrence with Ukraine. I called for sanctions and weapons before the invasion. I think we should be doing the same thing with Taiwan. We need to arm them and prepare them to provide deterrence along with AUKUS and the Quad to deter the Chinese from an invasion, which I think, again, would be devastating. Iran is at 85% enrichment. You know, the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had 80% enrichment. They're already there, Mr. Secretary. 90%, they say, is weapons grade. What are we doing to stop this? And are we giving the Iranians a strong message that a nuclear Iran is not acceptable? We're seeing China come into the Middle East and negotiate agreements between Saudis and Iran. I haven't seen the Abraham Accords expanded at all under your tenure. But we have to make it clear to them what a nuclear Iran would mean, and we have to support Israel in that fight. Meanwhile, our president rescinded the migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico, that the State Department was involved in, which opened our borders up into a wide open invasion from the cartels that now even your own Border Patrol admit have operational control of the border. That's my home state of Texas. I've been dealing with this issue as a federal prosecutor to chairman of Homeland, and now witnessing what I'm seeing is the worst I've ever seen. You and I have talked about fentanyls, and I applaud your efforts to talk to the leadership in China about the precursors coming from China into Mexico that have killed 100,000 young people in this country just over the last year. To put that in perspective, that's more than who died in the Vietnam War. And it's an attack on our young people. So, Mr. Secretary, my time's limited. There's so many things I could talk about that I don't have time. But right now, you are in a very important position in a very important time in history. And the parallels to 1939, when I go to Poland, they say it's Hitler invading Poland all over again. They see it that way. They have Auschwitz in their backyard. They remember the war crimes, as we see war crimes taking place in Ukraine. As I went to Bucha, as you know, to see the mass grave sites, and went to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky, and I will be going to Asia. Those two threats, the European theater and Pacific that my father's generation liberated from tyranny in strong support of freedom and democracy, are now at risk, at threat. Now they want to change the maps from what the greatest generation liberated. We cannot allow that to happen, sir. I want to work with you. We're all Americans. And I believe most members on this committee agree with that assessment. But I do have to point out my concerns, and I think the weaknesses, and we'll have more time to discuss that in our questioning. I want to just close with this, though. We had a Marine Sergeant, Vargas Andrews, testified before this committee that he had the suicide bomber in his sights before the bomb went off. He met with his team. He met with his intelligence team. An intelligence bulletin went out describing the suicide bomber. They got the identification. They got the PSYOPs. They pushed it up the chain of command, and the response was, I do not have authority to give you permission to engage against the threat. And the question was asked, well, who has the authority? I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. And guess what? Nobody got back to him. And then guess what? Just hours later, the bomb went off, killing 13 servicemen and women, 140 Afghanistans, and injuring 50, including Major Sergeant Andrews Vargas, who lost his limb, his leg, who had 40 surgeries. We have the mother of the woman, the Marine sergeant who was killed in that deadly blast. And I'll never forget giving her a hug, and she said, I'm devastated to know that this tragedy could have been prevented and my daughter could still be alive today, but for the negligence of what happened in Afghanistan that day, and I want to recognize her. Christy Shamble, and the mother of Marine Sergeant Nicole G., who was killed at Abbey Gate. She is in this room today. And let me just say to her and all the veterans of that conflict, you did not get wounded in vain. You did not die in vain. What you did was worth it because you protected America for 20 years from attacks. And I would ask that Christy Shamlin, if you could stand so you can be recognized. Now, I was told she was going to be here. There she is. Let me just close by saying, I will not rest, Christy, until we get answers, until people are held accountable for what happened to your daughter and the other servicemen and women and the Afghans. I will not rest until we get answers. And we will, if we have to go all the way up the chain of command to do it. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Secretary Blinken for appearing before the committee today to discuss the Biden administration's proposed international affairs budget for fiscal year 2024. Let me also thank you, Mr. Secretary, for we are the House Foreign Affairs Committee, for your focus on diplomacy. That's what this committee is all about. The HASC, the Arms Committee, deals with defense and DOD. And we know the significance and importance of diplomacy going alongside the Defense Department, with the Defense Department. And what the State Department and what we're here to discuss today has to deal with the responsibility that the Department of State has. And I am extremely glad to see that the administration's budget requests prioritize diplomacy and development, ensuring that we have the tools necessary to lead on the global stage and leverage the United States' soft power, which better positions the United States to address global challenges, deepen our alliances, and advance our U.S. interests. Fact of the matter, Mr. Secretary, had not President Biden led, when we talk about particularly the Ukraine, led by having our allies join with us, if we had jumped out there by ourselves, Putin would have been right. We would have been divided. NATO would not be strong. The EU would not be where it is, all working collectively together to fight back the aggression of Vladimir Putin and Russia. It is that unity is what put us there where we are today with Ukraine, which at the time no one thought we would be here a year later with Ukraine still standing. But it is the leadership and the strength that the Biden administration showed in holding our allies together that we're able to say that we're going to stay and continue to give the Ukrainians what they need until they win. And we're not going to make any decisions without the Ukrainians. And I think that is what is extremely important to make sure that we follow that model, even as we deal with China, which is why I do think that the chairman's trip to South Korea, to Japan and Taiwan, similar to the trip that I did along with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi last year, is important because we can't just say we're going to go at China by ourselves. We need our allies and alliances together in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, in Africa, in Central and South America, in fact, indeed, around the world. It has to be America leading other nations and not America alone. If you're leading, you have to lead somebody. And bringing our folks together is what you do at the State Department and the men and women of the State Department who do a job every day. In fact, I say they are unheralded heroes and sheroes that we sometimes forget about. So it is vital to our national security for the State Department to be adequately funded. It is also incumbent upon Congress to regularly pass authorization legislation for the State Department so that we can ensure that our diplomats have the tools they need to advance American interests around the world. You know, under my chairmanship in the last Congress, I've worked on a bipartisan basis to accomplish this, passing State Department authorization bills into law in both 2021 and 2022. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that such bills became law. And I know in working with Chairman McCall, we can continue that bipartisan work and make a state authorization as routine as the must-pass NDAA is. And I hope we can make similar progress on authorizing foreign assistance and the U.S. Agency for International Development. I don't see moving these types of bills as optional or as favors to the Department of, or USAID. Rather, it's core to our job as authorizers. In discussions surrounding the budget, I must admit that I am concerned by some of the extreme proposals emanating from the other side of the aisle that, if implemented, would threaten the United States' capacity to carry out bold diplomacy and the development work that has impacted so many lives. The across-the-board cuts that I hear coming from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are arbitrary and counter to our most serious needs. Some of the same extreme voices who claim in one breath that the Biden administration is not doing enough to counter China will in another breath advocate cutting the diplomatic and development budget necessary to outcompete China. Which is it? As President Biden famously said, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." If my colleagues truly want to address the rise of China, not to mention many other complex global challenges, cutting our diplomatic capacity and the funding of programs that strengthen American soft power is exactly the wrong way to do it. You know, China has surpassed the United States in the number of diplomatic posts worldwide to 280 posts compared to our 275. And from 2013 to 2018, China doubled its diplomacy budget. Moreover, this debate can't focus only on China. The United States must broaden our diplomatic footprint and expand our geopolitical presence and influence. Our relationships around the world will be pivotal to meeting the global challenges we face, whether it is Putin's renewed aggression in Ukraine, the root causes of migration in Central and South America, the existential threat of climate change, pandemics, democratic backsliding, or human rights abuses around the world. This committee has to consider all of that. That is our jurisdiction. The United States has a great role to play in shaping the world we want to live in. And we should utilize every opportunity to build coalitions of allies and partners who share our democratic values. That's who we are. If we once again adapt an America alone or America only foreign policy, our competitors and adversaries will fill that void. We're just opening it up for China or Russia. We have a choice to make, and this committee should make clear where it stands. Do we want to strengthen American global leadership, or are we going to allow the extreme wing of the party of the Republican Party to weaken our national security. Our State Department is vital to our national security. It makes Americans more secure and advances a more prosperous and stable world. That is why ensuring the department has the funding it needs is so crucial. And I hope we can work in a bipartisan manner to not only give our diplomats the tools they need to succeed, but ensure the best individuals are being hired and promoted at State to represent our great nation around the world. So, I say that, Mr. Secretary, as you know, one of my top priorities has been to address inequities and disparities in career progression for officers belonging to historically excluded groups at the department. And I am happy, I'm glad to see the steps that have been taken to address this issue, but I know we can even do more. And I hope the department will continue to make progress on improving equity and diversity within the institution. On that note, let me thank you personally for the decision you announced yesterday to end the department's practice of issuing assignment restrictions as a condition on granting security clearances. Many of us have been concerned for a decade about this unnecessary practice, which has caused harm to the careers of many employees simply because of their racial, ethnic, or national origin. This was the right decision, and I commend you for that. So, Secretary Blinken, let me again thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony and answers to what I know will be thoughtful questions from our members. And let me lastly say to all that are here, and particularly those who've lost their lives in Afghanistan, those during the evacuation and for the 20 years. I would hope that this committee will look at the entire 20 years, so that we can look and learn and make sure mistakes that we have made, we correct them, make sure that there's not one life of an American soldier and our allies, because none of them, and I agree with the chairman on this, there's not a single life that was lost in vain. We thank the men and women of our services and those who served in Afghanistan for their bravery, for standing, and for fighting for the interests of the United States of America. We will never, ever forget them. We will make sure that we work collectively together, and I think this is one area that, we have several veterans still on our committee. There's no greater service to our country than those that put their lives on the line to defend our country. And we should never, ever, ever forget those and the families that have lost their loved ones in the line of duty in supporting the United States of America. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Well said. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased today to have the 71st Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, before us today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and we ask that you keep your remarks to 5 minutes. I now recognize you, sir, the Secretary of State, for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much. To you, to Ranking Member Meeks, to all the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the administration's proposed FY24 budget for the State Department and the Agency for International Development. Let me say at the outset that I join both of you, I join every member of this committee in saluting all of our veterans of Afghanistan, saluting those who lost their lives, gave their lives so that their fellow citizens could enjoy a greater measure of security. And particularly the presence of Sergeant Key's mother here today. I am humble in your presence. I think of the 13. I think of the 2,402 Americans who lost their lives over 20 years in Afghanistan, serving and protecting our country. I think of the 20,000 plus wounded. And I think of so many others who served and have injuries of a different kind, including members of my State Department team. And I join you, Mr. Chairman. I join you, Ranking Member Meeks, I think I join every member of this committee in being determined that we look, and not only look, but draw the lessons from 20 years, including the last year in Afghanistan. We do meet at an inflection point. The post-Cold War world is over. There is an intense competition underway to determine what comes next. The United States has a positive vision for that future, a world that is free, that is open, secure, and that's prosperous. The budget that we put before you will, in our judgment, advance that vision and deliver on the issues that matter most to the American people by preparing us to meet two major sets of challenges that are distinct but also overlapping. The first set is posed by our strategic competitors, the immediate acute threat posed by Russia's autocracy and aggression most destructively through this brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, and the long-term challenge from the People's Republic of China. The second set is posed by a series of shared global tests, including the climate crisis, migration, food and energy insecurity, pandemics, all of which directly impact the lives and the livelihoods of Americans and people around the world. With this committee's leadership and support across two State Department authorization bills, the United States is in a stronger geopolitical position than we were 2 years ago to address these challenges. We've drawn enormous power from investments that we've made in our economic strength and technological edge here at home, including through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships has grown stronger. In fact, they've never been stronger. We're expanding our presence in critical regions, like the Indo-Pacific. We are leading unprecedented coalitions, including a number of new ones, to confront aggression and to address humanitarian crises around the world. The President's FY24 budget, the request for the State Department and USAID meet this moment head-on. The budget will sustain our security, economic, energy, and humanitarian support for Ukraine to ensure that President Putin's war remains a strategic failure. The budget will also strengthen our efforts to outcompete the PRC. President Biden is firmly committed to advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is why this proposal asks for an 18% increase in our budget for that region over FY23. The budget contains both discretionary and mandatory proposals for new, innovative investments to outcompete China, including by enhancing our presence in the region, ensuring what we and our fellow democracies have to offer, including things like maritime security, disease surveillance, clean energy infrastructure, digital technology, is more attractive than the alternative being proposed to them. The budget will help us push back on advancing authoritarianism and democratic backsliding by strengthening democracies around the world, including through supporting independent media, countering corruption, defending free and fair elections. And it will allow us to pay our contributions to international organizations because the United States needs to be at the table wherever and whenever new international rules that affect the livelihoods of our people are debated and decided. The budget will allow us to continue leading the world in addressing some of these global challenges, from food and energy insecurity to climate and health crises. And on that last point, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR. I think one of the greatest achievements in American foreign policy over the last decades. It's helped save 25 million lives around the world. This budget will help us continue the fight against HIV/AIDS while advancing health security more broadly through a new Bureau of Global Health Security and Diplomacy, which I look forward to working with Congress to establish this year. The budget will advance our efforts to modernize the State Department, including by expanding our training float, updating our technology, carrying out diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, including to make our overseas missions more accessible. I'm grateful for the progress that we've already made together, including Congress's support in updating the Secure Embassies Construction and Counterterrorism Act and Accountability Review Board that give us more flexibility to open new missions and to better manage the risks that our people face. We know there's more to do, and we look forward to working with the Congress and this committee to accelerate modernization efforts so that the Department can better attract, retain, as well as support our first-rate workforce as they advance our interests in what is a very complex and fast-moving world. Finally, the budget will further a personal priority for me that I know is shared by the leadership and members of this committee, and that is supporting Enduring Welcome, our whole-of-government effort to resettle our Afghan allies. Keeping our promises to those who serve the U.S. remains an unwavering priority. This budget will help us continue to make good on that commitment. Mr. Chairman, when I began this role, I committed to working to really restore the partnership between the executive branch and Congress when it comes to our foreign policy making. I'm determined to continue to work with you, the ranking member, the members of this committee, to do that. and I very much look forward to the close coordination over the coming year. Grateful for the chance to appear before you today and to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me just say, we had a very powerful, compelling hearing on the events in Afghanistan at the end. When the Abbey Gate was compromised and the suicide bomber went off and people were killed. And I think the American people deserve answers. And they want people to be held accountable for that. We haven't had a public hearing specifically on Afghanistan until the one we had just 2 weeks ago. And we heard testimony that, quite frankly, I was not even aware of, that the suicide bomber was, that we had him in our sights. The sniper had him, and he could have been taken out, and the threat could have been eliminated, and lives could have been saved. This is why we've asked you for documents. And so I want to go through the document requests we've made. On January 12th, I sent you this letter requesting documents related to the Afghanistan withdrawal. We did not get that, at that time, did not get that production. So on January 30th, we requested 3 specific items to be delivered February 7th. Most importantly, the dissent cable. As you know, 23 of our State Department officials at the embassy in Kabul took the extraordinary measure to raise their dissent to the policy, sir, that you and your administration were effectuating. I think the American people need to see this. We need to know what their dissent was. Why were they objecting to your policy in the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan? Sent another letter on March the 3rd. And another one on March 20th. In fact, Chairman Meeks requested this dissent cable in August 2021 letter. That again, no response. Yet here we are today. I do the after action report. I want to thank you for that production, and I know the ambassador's after action review and is going to be presented in 3 weeks. But we need this dissent cable, and I think the American people deserve to see it, to know what in the world was going on in those critical weeks, especially after the testimony of Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews. He deserves to know. Christy Shamblin deserves to know what the dissent was. I have the subpoena. It's right here. And I'm prepared to serve this. Now, we've had discussions. And I think, you know, as a former federal prosecutor, you want to work things out, but when you can't, you have to go forward with a subpoena, an arrest warrant, and indictment. So, sir, I'm going to give you until the close of business on Monday to produce that dissent cable to this committee and this Congress so the American people can see what the employees at the embassy in Kabul were thinking about your policy that they dissented from. Do you have any response?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to make clear that we are working to provide all the information that this committee is looking for, and that its oversight responsibilities give it the authority to secure. And as you noted, we just produced the Embassy Action Plan, thousands of pages that go along with that. We're committed to making available and sharing the substance of the after-action review within the next 3 weeks. and you heard that from the White House. And as to the Dissent Channel cable, I appreciate everything you're saying. And let me just put this very briefly in perspective for members of the committee who may not follow this. This tradition of having a dissent channel is one that is cherished in the department and goes back decades. It's a unique way for anyone in the department to speak truth to power as they see it without fear or favor. And they do it by the regulations we established for these cables in a privileged and confidential way. It is vital to me that we preserve the integrity of that process and of that channel, that we not take any steps that could have a chilling effect on the willingness of others to come forward in the future to express dissenting views on the policies that are being pursued. I read every dissent channel cable that I get. I respond to every dissent channel cable that I get, and we factor into our thinking what we hear from colleagues who have a different view. By our regulations, these cables may only be shared with senior officials in the department. And again, that's to protect the integrity of the process, to make sure we don't have a chilling effect on those who might want to come forward, knowing that they will have their identities protected and that they can do so, again, without fear or favor. Having said that, I very much understand and appreciate that there's a real interest in the substance of that particular cable by this committee. And in that spirit, following up on conversations that we've already had, again, we are prepared to make the relevant information in that cable available, including through a briefing or some other mechanism. So I'm determined to have our team follow up. And Mr. Chairman, as we've discussed, we'll continue to work that in the coming days. I hope that we can reach an accommodation. I really do understand and appreciate the importance of the substance of that information being shared with the committee, and I hope we can find a way to do it that meets both of our needs.
Well, I hope so too. The subpoena specifically asked for the dissent cable. I know it's classified as well, and I appreciate that, but I do want to mention your department cited then Secretary Henry Kissinger's refusal to produce a dissent cable to Congress in the 1970s as a precedent. I would argue you do not have an executive privilege on this cable. And then we reached out to the author of that dissent cable, Ambassador Tom Boyett, earlier this week. He said the reason that Henry Kissinger refused to release the cable was because it was so damaging, so damning. Ambassador Boyett is emphatic about the need for the State Department to produce dissent channel cables. And in a statement he provided to the committee, he says that any claim providing by them to Congress that would have a chilling effect, as your staff has claimed, is, and I quote him directly, bullshit. Not my words, it's the ambassador. He writes, quote, congressional oversight enhances executive responsibility and enables us to learn from the inevitable mistakes, end of quote. So I believe this committee and the American people, after what happened, for God's sakes, after what happened in that dreadful August, need to see this cable. And, sir, we need you to respond. And if you fail, I am prepared to serve you with a subpoena. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Recognize, sorry.
let me just start off by saying that the chairman is correct that I did request on August 21st a copy of any and all dissent cables on Afghanistan dating back to 2017 and pledged to work with the department on timing and appropriate handling of the requested material. However, I hope that the chairman also agrees that we should take care to avoid a chilling effect on employees, as you stated. Safe space for dissent is important, ongoing, even as I hope the department works to accommodate this congressional request, because I think the substance that is in the cable is tremendously important for members of this committee to know. And if we do it in a classified session, but I understand the protection of what you talk about as far as the the members of the State Department so they have their discretion. But let me go now also to say thank you, Mr. Secretary, because we did have hearings on Afghanistan in the 117th Congress. And fact of the matter is, you were the first to testify before this committee, right after the pullout. You were the very first cabinet official to do so right before this committee, and we had several other hearings in regards to Afghanistan in the 117th Congress. But let me get to what we're here for today. The President's budget proposal lays out a strategic vision for the U.S. global engagement that would allow the United States to deepen our alliances, to tackle the most pressing global challenges, and effectively compete with our adversaries. Speaker McCarthy and the House Republican majority have put forward a different vision, one that would cede American leadership on the world stage and threaten U.S. national security by arbitrarily slashing the international affairs budget by up to 22%. Now, my colleague, Rosa DeLauro, had sent a letter to the agency requesting details on the projected impact of these cuts that the Republicans are proposing. Let me ask a few questions on that, because the department is saying that making cuts as deep as 22% on the international affairs budget would, among other things, and I quote, will it significantly scale back our efforts to counter aggressive and coercive tactics of the PRC and to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy? Is that correct? Yes or no, sir?
That is correct.
Would it reduce efforts to deter the PRC's aggression and coercion, including through the Countering PRC Influence Fund, and slow our ability to open new posts in the Pacific Islands?
Yes, it would.
Would it reduce assistance that is critical to enhancing military-to-military interoperability, training, cooperation, as well as fighting corruption and money laundering?
Yes.
Would the treaty-based commitments, such as payment of U.S. assessments to international organizations, would also be jeopardized?
They would be.
You'd be required to impose a broad hiring freeze and potentially reductions in force, while also rolling back training and professional development programs recently authorized in the state authorization bill on a bipartisan basis. Would that not be true?
That is correct.
And to halt investments in security upgrades at our most vulnerable posts, increasing the physical risk to the United States government personnel overseas,
That is correct.
and to reduce support for ongoing programs that support an independent, democratic, politically stable, and economically viable Ukraine that can defend itself against external aggression. Would it not also do that, sir?
That is correct.
And to reverse gains made to combat infectious diseases, including through the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, programs to prevent maternal and childhood deaths, and funds to support health workers and global health security. Is that not also true, sir?
That is also true.
And the list goes on and on, doesn't it? So I see I only have, in my limited time remaining, have I missed anything else? Mr. Secretary, what are your greatest concerns if these draconian cuts were imposed on the State Department?
I think across the board, when it comes to all of the priorities that I laid out in my opening statement, to try to advance the security of the United States and American citizens around the world, to strengthen even further our alliances and partnerships to deal with challenges coming from Russia and China, to deal effectively with the many transnational threats that are having a direct impact on the lives and livelihoods of Americans, to make sure that our own institution is as strong as it can be, including from cyber threats, that our personnel are secure and safe, even as we work to expand our footprint abroad. Across the board, these cuts would have, in my judgment, devastating consequences. And I am happy as well to lay out in detail for members of this committee, if it's helpful, what we see those consequences as being.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have 4 questions, Mr. Secretary, and welcome to the committee again.
Thank you.
The zero-draft WHO pandemic treaty that the administration and others are pushing to get put into effect at the WHO, starts off with a harsh criticism of the United States and the international community by calling it a catastrophic failure of the community in showing solidarity and equity in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I've read the treaty. I'm concerned about it. Article 4 pays lip service to sovereignty, and then has language that says, however, activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to their peoples and countries, so therefore WHO would be empowered to step in. And we're talking about Tedros, a man who's been put into that position by the People's Republic of China. He was their candidate and obviously showed terrible, terrible judgment in the beginning and even to this day in recognizing the origins of the of COVID-19. Article 10 says that 20%, the United States would be obligated to provide 20% of our medical supplies, including tests, antiviral vaccines, medications, and the like, to WHO. For them, they just say, we want it, you have to give it by treaty obligation. The sovereignty issue is the biggest, in my opinion. You're pushing for it. Next year is probably when it may get adopted. Will it be sent to the Senate for ratification? Or are you planning on using the executive agreement, which I think is a terrible way to do things? It ought to go to the Senate for ratification. Secondly, yesterday I chaired a hearing on Daniel Ortega's ever-worsening dictatorship in Nicaragua. And the day before, so that would be 2 days ago, EWTN journalist Owen Jensen asked John Kirby, are you aware of any efforts the U.S. is making to free Bishop Alvarez? And as you know, he got 26 years in prison in what is Ortega's war on the Catholic Church. Well, the spokesman, John Kirby, said, I'm going to have to take the question and get back to you. I'm not tracking that particular case. I hope that wasn't a revelation of priorities. If you could speak to the issue of what Ortega is doing, we need to look at every type of pressure we could bring to bear. He just had the foreign minister of Iran to his country, as you know, to Managua, to the capital. So I hope you would speak to that. Thirdly, on Nigeria, I appeal again to you to redesignate them as a CPC country. As you know, the Commission on International Religious Freedom has called your decision inexplicable, and it is a turning of the blind eye because more Christians have been killed in Nigeria, and the government has done precious little to stop it, and over 17,000 churches destroyed. I've been to several of those churches and saw firebomb churches from Boko Haram and others. So that, and finally on China, when you meet and talk with your counterparts in the PRC and the president himself, do you raise names in particular, like Gao Zhejiang and others, because it's very important that they be front and center.
Congressman, thank you very much. Good to see you again as well. First, I'll try and be brief. We are not engaged in negotiating a COVID treaty. What we're engaged in is trying to strengthen the global architecture for dealing with pandemics and do it in a way that, for example, make sure that if there's a next time, and I think there inevitably will be a next time, that countries actually are committed to transparency, to sharing information, to giving access to international inspectors, that we have the tools to do that, and the countries agree to that. That's, of course, not what China did in this instance, and we've all paid a price for that. At the same time, I think what we clearly demonstrated is over the course of the pandemic, the United States was the leading and most generous country in making sure that vaccines could be made available to those who needed them. We did it through COVAX. We did it free of charge. We did it without political strings attached, and I can tell you that has dramatically benefited our diplomacy and our standing in the world, especially in contrast to the way other countries have done this. But we're happy to work with you on this, and I take the points that you've raised. Bishop Alvarez is very much on my mind and on the mind of the State Department. As you know, the Nicaraguans expelled more than 200 political prisoners. The good news, of course, is that they were freed from jail. The bad news is they can't live in their own country and freely express themselves. I met with the leaders of the Democratic opposition who were freed at the State Department, heard them, and believe me, Bishop Alvarez should be released, and we'll continue to work on that. When it comes to Nigeria, I very much appreciate what you've said. We are working day in, day out, standing up for the rights of persecuted religious minorities around the world. I think the report speaks for itself and speaks to why we do certain designations, why we don't do others. I'm happy to follow up with you offline. And then on China, yes, absolutely. We name names. I name names. I've gone over repeatedly with my counterparts in China the names of people who are being, in our judgment, detained for political reasons and who should be freed. And at the same time, there are, of course, American citizens who remain unjustly detained. We're working on that every day. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. The Secretary has till 1:30 p.m., so I'm going to hold members to their 5 minutes so we can get to all the members on the committee. Chair now recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
The withdrawal from Afghanistan, of course, involved dissent. There were many people who said we should have left thousands of troops there. Of course, once Trump told the American people we were leaving, the American people would not stand for that. There has never been a pristine, casualty-free withdrawal in that situation, especially when you have hundreds of thousands of people who are desperate to flee their country. You saw that in our withdrawal from Vietnam, and we saw that with the partition of India, where hundreds of thousands of people moved or millions of people moved and hundreds of thousands died. As to Iran, the chairman is correct that Iran is very, very close to a nuclear weapon. And I'll simply point out that the prior president pulled out of the JCPOA without a plan to do anything to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. And so the Saudis seem to have taken action on the assumption that Iran was about to become a nuclear power. Mr. Secretary, I want to implore you on an issue that may not otherwise come up. You're focused on the great issues of war and peace, the things historians will write about, and that competes for your time with the basic operations of the State Department, passports and visas. The passport system is broken and has been since the beginning of COVID. Visas, if we did a better job on visas, that would be the most important thing we could do with our public diplomacy program and winning hearts and minds. And when it comes to business, it's impossible to get people to invest in America if it's going to take them 6 months to do a business deal. And I would hope that business visas would proceed at the speed of private sector business. So I want to implore you on that, move to a question. Last September, Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. You're now in a formal setting. Can you assure the world that no agency of the U.S. government blew up those pipelines or facilitated that action?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Putin has told us he wants to restore the Soviet Union. There are those who argue that we should have done nothing to help Ukraine, that what goes on Ukraine stays in Ukraine, and that we don't have an interest there. Obviously, if we had announced we were doing nothing, Europe would have done nothing, and Putin might well have been in Kyiv in a week or two. If that had happened, I think President Xi would be emboldened. But let's focus on Russia. If Russia had been able to take over the Ukraine in a matter of weeks, would that have satiated Putin or encouraged him to go after Moldova, the Baltics, and Poland?
In my judgment, the latter.
Thank you. Turning to Ethiopia, the State Department released a summary determination indicating that while all parties were guilty of war crimes, the Ethiopian military, the Eritrean military, and the Amhara forces committed crimes against humanity, and that the Amhara forces committed ethnic cleansing. During testimony last year, your Assistant Secretary Molly Fee committed that the United States will not support international loans or the restoration of AGOA to Ethiopia until the Ethiopian government fulfills its obligations under the peace agreement, including unrestricted humanitarian aid, protection for civilians, human rights monitoring, and the restoration of services, including the Internet. Do you reaffirm that commitment?
I do, and indeed, that's actually what we're seeing happening. I just came back from Ethiopia. Happy to address that in greater detail, but yes, the basic,
I thank you. And
basic point, yes.
The head of Save the Children has just returned from there and reports that things are getting are getting better. Can you think of anything that would help President Xi expand his power more than if the United States were to cut our diplomatic efforts by 22%?
There may be some other things, but that would certainly be on a top 5 list.
And finally, what can we do to help the Rohingya, who are so desperate they fled to Bangladesh? And some remain, of course, in Myanmar, Burma.
As you know, I made a genocide determination when it comes to the Rohingya last year. We are doing everything we possibly can to continue to get humanitarian assistance into Burma, despite the situation there, including to help Rohingya. Of course, many Rohingya are refugees in other countries. We work to support them there. We work to make sure that countries don't engage in refoulement. That would send them back.
And finally, I just want to implore you to try to open up the corridor to Artsakh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the chairman is correct. There is an alliance of war criminal Putin invading Ukraine, the CCP threatening Taiwan, the rogue regime planning to vaporize Israel and then vaporize the United States. Mr. Secretary, as I agree with President Donald Trump that the surrender in Afghanistan was the most damaging foreign policy military decision in American history solely by the President of the United States, Mr. Biden. I want to submit for the record letters I've sent to the administration requesting correspondence the President claims to have had from top military officials who he blamed for the decision to surrender. These letters remain unanswered. I look forward to your response as the State Department was in charge of the surrender.
Without objection, so ordered.
Additionally, as the grateful father of Hunter Wilson, an Afghan veteran, I appreciate so much the Americans who have served to protect America since 9/11, and particularly always in mind the 13 who were murdered at Abbey Gate. With that in mind, Mr. Secretary, how many American citizens and licensed permanent residents are in Afghanistan today, and are any of them currently being held hostage by the Taliban?
Congressman, there are several Americans who are being detained by the Taliban. We are working to secure their freedom. The families have asked that we protect their identities and don't speak publicly to their cases.
Now, those are being detained. How many other Americans?
How many other Americans? There are approximately, let me put it this way, since August 31st of last year, we have helped about 975 American citizens who wished to leave Afghanistan do so. As we speak, Americans who identify themselves to us, American citizens who identify themselves to us who are in Afghanistan, some of whom have been there since the withdrawal, some of whom went back to Afghanistan. There are about, that we're in contact with, about 175. 44 of them are ready to leave, and we are working to effectuate their departure.
Well, their security is just so important for the American people, and I urge everything. But again, it's just inexcusable, the surrender and the consequence of the invasion of Ukraine, the threats to Taiwan, the threats of vaporization of the people of Israel and America because of, sadly, the weakness that has been displayed.
I see it very differently, Congressman. I see us ending America's longest war. I think that's a good thing for the United States. It freed up our ability to devote focus and resources on Ukraine to deal with the rise of China.
Mr. Secretary, we are in a global war on terrorism. It is not over. And by allowing safe havens in Afghanistan, you're putting the American people at risk. It's my understanding there are now 27 terrorist organizations actively working. We already know Osama bin Laden operated out of a cave in Afghanistan. We don't need to learn that again.
More than a decade ago, as you know, we took out the leader in Afghanistan, the successor leader of al-Qaeda, Mr. Zawahiri. We took out a leading financier in Somalia who was helping to finance any return of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We've demonstrated the ability to continue to go at those who would do us harm.
You've created a safe haven in Afghanistan. I mean, it's inconceivable. And President Trump was correct. Bagram should have never been abandoned. With that in mind, the administration has been inexcusable in its delay providing weapons systems defensive to Ukraine. In fact, the long-range missiles that could be provided have been delayed. These could be so helpful because they could destroy the Iranian drones that are currently located illegally, obviously, in Crimea. And so what is being done to release the latest equipment, hey, let's stop a war. We can do that by providing proper defensive equipment.
Congressman, I share absolutely your commitment to make sure that we're getting the Ukrainians what they need when they need it to deal with the Russian aggression. That's what we've done going back before day one, including drawdowns of equipment in September before the aggression, in December before the aggression, to make sure that they actually had in hand what they needed to repel it if it came, including Stingers and Javelins. So the allegation that we were not doing that is simply wrong. Second, every step along the way, we have worked and led an international coalition of more than 50 countries, the Secretary of Defense, putting together a remarkable process in Ramstein, Germany, to rally these countries to provide, along with us, the
Hey, as we
assistance they need.
conclude, I want to quote, of all things, the Washington Post, March 10, had a lead editorial that the legacy of the president and you will be whether we have success, and that is expelling Putin, war criminal, from Ukraine. That is victory, expelling him and his murderers from Ukraine. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Blinken. Listening to my friends on the other side, especially the opening statement of the chairman, I'm reminded of the line in The Wizard of Oz, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Because apparently you have single-handedly left the world in a mess. There's no historic context. So I want to ask a series of questions to try to get my mind around the history behind things. So, for example, the chairman mentioned Iran's about to become a nuclear power. Oh my, how could that happen? Well, Mr. Secretary, was there an agreement, I don't know, anywhere, that actually pushed back the nuclear development in Iran and in fact was working in all respects in terms of metrics?
There was. It was called the JCPOA, and it put Iran's nuclear program in a box, as verified not only by international inspectors, but by our own intelligence community.
Ah, I remember that now. And I seem to recall my friends on the other side of the aisle opposed it. And then what happened to that agreement that was working?
The previous administration decided to leave the agreement.
I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary, couldn't hear that.
Yes, the previous administration decided to leave the agreement.
The Trump administration.
That's correct.
Ah, okay. My. Afghanistan. I mean, terrible thing that happened in August of 2021, but did it have any antecedent? For example, was there anybody who said, we're going to negotiate in Doha with the Taliban and we're going to actually exclude the government of Afghanistan we're allegedly supporting? Did that happen?
The previous administration negotiated an agreement with the Taliban that called for the withdrawal of all American forces from Afghanistan by May 31st of 2021, released 5,000 Taliban prisoners.
Oh,
and
those terrorists that Mr. Wilson was concerned about.
in addition, drew down our own forces over time to
Oh, my
2,500 when
goodness.
the present administration took office.
And that was also, was that the Biden administration?
As I said, that was the previous administration,
Well, I'm sorry, did that have a name?
the Trump administration.
Trump administration, thank you, okay. Was there a president of the United States who said that he believed the word of, a sociopath Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence community with respect to Russian interference in American elections? Did that happen?
I recall press accounts to that effect, yes.
And did that president have a name?
I believe that was President Trump.
Was there a president who denied javelins, critical part of the arsenal for Ukraine to defend itself before the war that began last February and March, over a political issue, trying to get dirt on a political opponent? Did that happen?
Based on press accounts and testimony before Congress, I believe that it did, yes.
And who was that?
That was the previous president, President Trump.
President Trump. Was there a president who disparaged NATO and said it was obsolete and we probably don't really need it anymore? Any president ever say that in the history of, since the founding 73 years ago of NATO?
Based on public statements that I've read, yes, I believe that President Trump said that.
And from your point of view as the secretary, current secretary, is NATO playing any kind of non-obsolete role in the current war in Europe?
NATO is playing an absolutely essential, vital role in ensuring the security of Europe and deterring further aggression by Russia against Europe.
Most of us kind of find, we're worried about the climate. Was there any kind of, I don't know, international agreement on the climate accord that had every nation on Earth as a member except for 2?
That would be the Paris Agreement.
And what happened to that?
The United States at one point withdrew from the Paris Agreement. President Biden re-engaged us in Paris.
And again, Mr. Blinken, did that president who withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord that had all countries on Earth but 2, what was the name of that president who withdrew us from that?
Again, in this case, the Trump administration withdrew from that agreement.
Well, I just say we might all have cause to say lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. But it ain't about the Biden policies. It's about the previous administration that left a mess and that cost lives because of decisions made or not made with respect to relations across the board. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. We appreciate that performance. It was quite entertaining. Chair now recognizes.
I would just say to the chairman with respect, I did not mean for it to be entertaining.
Yeah, right.
I meant for it to be
Chair recognizes Mr. Perry.
It was
a statement
factual.
of history.
It was factual.
Mr. Perry.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Secretary, we're honored by your presence. I just note from your resume, you've been at this a long time, just went from 1994 to the present. You've been at the State Department, National Security Council, Center for Strategic and International Studies, you were director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States for National Security Advisor to the Vice President, Deputy National Security Advisor, Deputy Secretary of State, and of course now the Secretary of State. So you got a lot of experience. Do you consider the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a civilian institution as it presents itself to be?
Congressman, particularly in China, institutions that present themselves as civilian in practice are usually organs of the state. And in any event, even when they are on paper private, answer to the state.
So does that mean you
I don't, in the particular instance of Wuhan, I can't speak directly to it except to say that in a sense it doesn't matter because they answer to the state.
Well, okay, so in 2005, when you were director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, did you know that China was not in compliance with the chemical and bioweapons treaty obligations for which it was supposed to comply?
We've had concerns over many years about the compliance of a number of countries,
That's not the
including China.
question I asked you. Were you aware that they were not in compliance since 2005? I mean, I just kind of went through your resume here a little bit. I mean, you were deeply in at that point. Were you aware? Did you know?
I would have to go back and look. That's almost 20 years ago. I can't tell you at that particular
Do you
point in
know
time.
now?
We have real concerns about the
I
compliance.
know you have concerns. I'm asking if you know.
I'm telling you that we have real concerns about their compliance. The compliance.
So are they in compliance or aren't they?
So this is something that we can take up in a different setting, but we have real concerns about compliance.
Did you know about China's offensive biological weapons program and the CCP's Academy of Military Medical Sciences?
I can't speak to individual institutions, and I would have to go back and
Sure,
look
you're
to see.
the Secretary of State. This is important stuff. You can't tell if the CCP is currently complying with the bioweapons treaty obligations. You can't tell us whether you know about China's offensive biological weapons program. Are you familiar with the fact that the Academy of Military Medical Sciences worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, who received money from the United States of America, particularly the State Department, the Defense Department, the USAID, the NIH? Are you familiar with that?
As I said, Congressman, I'm familiar with the fact that, as a practical matter, there is little difference between purportedly private organizations and the state, and the fact that there is collaboration or would be collaboration between this particular institute and the state, including the Chinese military, is certainly of no surprise. By the way, one of the reasons
Okay, so
one of the reasons it's particularly helpful that we actually had programs to give us
Are
eyes
you
and ears
familiar with the
into
fact
the
that-
Chinese CDC and into places like Wuhan,
sure.
is precisely to have a better understanding of what's
I
going
know
on.
you want to understand. I know you're concerned. Are you familiar with the fact that the Chinese Communist Party announced that they were collaborating on chimeric viruses and that the CCP declared coronaviruses were the leading edge of genetic weapons warfare? Do you know that? You're
Again,
Secretary of State.
I'm happy to look at each of those statements, the documentation behind them. I can't speak to the specifics. I can tell you that, again, we have had for a long time, continue to have, real concerns about compliance
I know you
by
have
China with
concerns,
the
sir. Do
Biological
you
Weapons
know that
Convention and
during
the
your
Chemical Weapons
time,
Convention.
sir, in all these lofty positions, contracts, including ones with the state, the Department of State, DOD, USAID, et cetera, paid for research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, and there are reports that the CCP may have double billed the U.S. Since we have declared that the CCP has an illicit bioweapons program, should American taxpayers be funding this, number one? Number two, should we trust that China will do the right thing in its part with this WHO proposed convention?
We should not trust, we should verify.
What about
that's
paying?
exactly
Should the
what this is
American
about.
taxpayers pay for this?
I'm not sure whether this is, Congressman?
The research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in collaboration with the Academy of Military Medical Sciences for Biological Weapons.
We're not paying for that. As I said, in the past, we have had programs where our scientists, as well as our embassy, have had the ability to have eyes and ears in some of these places precisely so that we would have a better understanding of what was going on, and in particular to see if there were any safety or security concerns. There was one program that was before my time that ended in 2019 that USAID was engaged in. As I said, that program ended in 2019. It wasn't involved in so-called gain-of-function research, but as a general proposition, the benefit of these programs is to give us greater visibility on what's going on in places that we otherwise don't have eyes and ears on.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. There's not a hot spot, it seems to me, in the world that you haven't been at since you've assumed this office, and I want to personally thank you for your personal commitment, your family's sacrifice, clearly in the tradition of your late father, for all this work. I want to thank you, too, for your work trying to help Paul Whelan, who will be this month spending his 53rd birthday in a Russian war camp. 4 years wrongfully detained by the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin. So, Mr. Secretary, I'm holding in my hand a memo, a letter from the Russian Federation dated February 17th, 2022. And that's 7 days before Putin unleashed approximately 190,000 of his troops that were amassed on the Ukraine border with an effort to overtake Ukraine's capital, topple its government, set up a puppet government, and control Ukraine. I assume you're aware of this letter. It's an important letter because it makes clear what Putin's military demands were, and they go far beyond Ukraine, right in this memorandum, right in this letter. Putin made no bones about the fact what his military demands were as he was prepared to amass these troops. His demands were that he would take measures necessary if things didn't change beyond Ukraine. In fact, he wanted to unwind the clock of history back to reinstituting Soviet-like era boundaries and restrictions. And he wanted to effectively disarm one half of NATO, particularly the areas the most vulnerable in the Baltic states. So here it is, in black and white. And if we fail in assisting Ukraine to defend itself, we know what's next. And we know what the U.S. will honor in its Article 5 commitments, should he do what he's threatened to do here if he didn't have his demands met. And that means, if need be, deploying American troops on the ground, as we're required to, as President Biden has reaffirmed, and President Obama has reaffirmed, and President Bush has reaffirmed, and every Republican and Democratic president after Bush has reaffirmed since this was relevant. And is it clear to you, Mr. Secretary, we will do everything we can do to honor those Article 5 concerns, including, if necessary, troops on the ground?
The President has made that absolutely clear.
I say that because there are voices in this country right now, including voices seeking to be commander-in-chief in this country, that say that a mere phone call to Vladimir Putin and an agreement to seize all that territory that was illegally garnered by Russia through war crimes, through horrors that are unspeakable, the type of things that we haven't seen in Europe since the 1930s. But merely cede that away and walk away from our obligation. And there are other voices, too, voices dismissing the actions that Putin has taken, the illegal, horrific actions, and merely calling them a territorial dispute that the U.S. has no play in. We have to be aware of what's next. We have to be aware where we stand in this terrible time in history. We don't stand alone, fortunately, because of the commitment of President Biden and yourself and others to put together a coalition that Putin thought was unattainable because it was necessary. We couldn't win by ourselves. So this coalition is in place. And what stands in our way is it is not just defending Ukraine's interest, not just defending NATO's interest, not just defending Europe's interest, but defending the U.S. self-interest. And that's the point of our involvement in Ukraine. And here it is, in black and white, Putin's declaring exactly what it was. Let's not fail to acknowledge what he himself wants. And I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we'll kind of look backwards and forwards. Next month, you'll mark your 61st birthday, and
Don't remind me.
well, at my age, I'm jealous. But Mr. Secretary, you're one of the most qualified secretaries during my tenure. You have spent a very long time learning history and being prepared to not repeat it. So I'm going to give you just a couple of names: Saigon, Tehran, Benghazi, Tripoli, and Kabul. Each one of those, to most people in the State Department, represent a failure to smoothly withdraw, a failure to anticipate, and the like. Now, the chairman had a fairly lengthy discussion with you about what the committee wants and needs in order to do its oversight. And in a very Kissinger-like way, you gave answers not to his questions, but answers that were the ones that you came here prepared to give. Mr. Secretary, I have with me, you'll recognize it, this is what your discovery looks like often. This is actual discovery from the State Department. I might suggest to you, after our mutual many years of doing this, that your best choice is accommodation when appropriate, compliance when a subpoena comes, which means that this sort of redaction cannot and shall not be accepted by Congress once a subpoena is issued. I might also suggest that if you deliver something under the cloak of being secret or top secret, that redaction is by definition inappropriate. That in fact, if we view in camera, redaction is inappropriate. If today you can make the commitment that when the accommodations to this and other committees, but particularly this committee, when the accommodation is that we receive information in some in-camera form, that it be delivered sooner, not later, and redacted only for actual claimed privileges. if you can make that commitment, I think the chairman can rest assured that we won't be getting what I sometimes call a black cow eating a licorice at midnight.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that. What I can commit to is this. I can commit, as I have committed to the chairman, to finding a way to make sure that this committee gets the information that it rightly needs to conduct its oversight. And I need to do that in a way that, of course, as I said in the case of the Descent Channel cable, protects the integrity of that process, but making sure that you get the information. More broadly, when it comes to documents, of course, we have national security considerations. There may be legal considerations, but I take the point that you're making. I want to make sure that you get the information,
Well, and
that information
Mr.
is not
Secretary,
unnecessarily redacted.
since you've sat behind
Right.
the senators, and you've been on the other side, you're well aware that this co-equal body determines what it believes it needs to be seen. And with the exception of actual stated privileges, the court, if we have to go that far, makes it very clear that, in fact, we determine, not you, what our legislative needs and need to know is. So I might suggest that although that answer, again, in a very Kissinger-esque, is, I appreciate it.
I'll take that as a compliment.
It is. But please, put the other hat on that you wore when you sat on this side of the dais and recognize that the accommodation of sooner rather than later, in camera, if the chairman and the committee agree to it, allows us to then debate the smaller portion that might need to be made public or in some other way disseminated. I'd like to take an opportunity, because the world is listening, to speak past you for a moment, Mr. Secretary. The people who wrote the Descent cable are free to come to this committee, free to come to our staff, and free to come to the chairman as legitimate whistleblowers, to be fully protected. And if they come forward and produce their names, then I submit to you that at that point, the statement you made here today is moot. That, in fact, any member of the State Department who comes forward as a whistleblower on behalf of dissent of any sort leading up to the failed withdrawal from Kabul would be taken as a waiver of that history that we noted all the way back with the not late and in good health in New York, Henry Kissinger. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today, and I think we all owe you and the men and women of the State Department a great deal for the work that you do every single day, and I want to thank you personally for that. Over the past 2 years, the Biden administration has reestablished U.S. leadership on the global stage, deepening our strategic alliances and advancing our values and interests. And I really am grateful for Mr. Conley's recitation. I was sitting here listening to some of my Republican colleagues and wondering, did they miss the last 4 years? Did you, in fact, inherit an agreement by the prior administration to withdraw from Afghanistan by a date certain, and that also included the release of 5,000 Taliban fighters from prison?
That's correct.
Did you, in fact, inherit a decision from the prior administration to withdraw from the JCPOA that had kept Iran's nuclear program in check?
That is correct.
And you inherited a departure from the Paris Climate Accord.
That's right.
You also followed an administration that undermined the importance of NATO.
Well, that's a examination of judgment.
The prior president, President Trump, made public statements about the obsolescence of NATO, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And now they've proposed a budget that would decimate the development and diplomatic budget by up to 22%. Is that correct?
We've shared our concerns about proposed cuts to the budget proposal.
And I don't remember hearing from my Republican colleagues on this committee criticize any of those 5 events. And so it's rich to hear today this, as I think Mr. Conley said, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. So I want to ask you, Secretary Blinken, first with respect to the U.S. Obligations in multilateral organizations and peacekeeping entities. How do you assess the damage that is caused to U.S. credibility by our failing to stay current with our obligations? And if Congress were to grant the requested funds and authorities, how would the U.S. be able to change the dynamics in these institutions in our favor and in advancement of the national security interests of the United States?
Congressman, thank you for raising that. I think it's an important point because we find ourselves in a almost contorted ourselves in that we are by far the largest contributor to most of the programs in these organizations, and yet, precisely because we find ourselves in some instances in arrears, our competitors, our adversaries point to that to say that we're actually not doing our part, we're not serious about those organizations. So it actually undermines our standing, it undermines our diplomacy. It's something we constantly have to correct, and I think that could be easily rectified by simply making sure that we're current with our obligations.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, earlier this week, I traveled to the United Nations in New York to attend the second ever ARIA Formula meeting at the UN Security Council to focus on the specific vulnerabilities of LGBTQI plus persons. And particularly, we heard about an increase in violence and anti-LGBTQI plus rhetoric and legislation throughout the continent of Africa. Can you just speak to what you are doing, what the embassies are doing in terms of staff and resources and coordination to confront these threats, and what Congress can do to help in that effort?
Thank you. This is a deep concern of ours. We've seen that marginalized groups, particularly the LGBTQI plus community in many countries, is under increased threat and increased siege. In fact, as I think you know, we put out just this week, and I put out personally, our annual human rights report, and one of the things that it documents is precisely that. So we're very much engaged around the world in a variety of ways in trying to make sure that we are advocating, encouraging, pressing countries to uphold the rights of all marginalized communities, including the LGBTQI plus community, and that they are, in the first instance, of course, protecting and defending those rights, in the second instance, not taking measures that would further undermine those rights. We do it in different ways in different places. We try to make sure that we're both sensitive to local considerations, because we want to be as effective as we can be. So sometimes it's private, sometimes it's public, sometimes it's a combination of both, but our embassies are seized with this, and this really goes to, I think, a core tenet of view that I believe many Americans share, which is that all democracies are strengthened by protecting vulnerable populations, whatever they may be. We're equally engaged on pushing back against the persecution of religious minorities around the world. We see that, too, as a huge problem.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Finally, Turkey's use of its existing F-16 fleet to challenge Greek sovereignty and its refusal to rule out using upgraded F-16s to do so and continue to violate Greek territorial airspace undermines NATO unity, and I know that's an important priority for you. Would you speak to what steps the administration is taking to ensure that American weapons are not used to threaten allies and partners in Greece, Cyprus, and northern Syria?
Thank you, Congressman. The focus of our efforts, whether it's with Turkey, whether it's with Greece, whether it's with any other NATO ally, is to make sure that they have the equipment and technology that they need to be fully interoperable with NATO, to make sure that they can do everything that they need to do as a NATO ally, while at the same time, of course, ensuring that to the extent there are any disputes between them, that any equipment or technology we provide is not used in furtherance of those differences or those disputes. So that's certainly the case. We believe that Turkey should get the upgraded F-16s and the modernization package for their existing F-16s. We think it's important to NATO, important to the alliance. At the same time, we are working assiduously to try and ensure that any tensions that exist between NATO allies, in this case Greece and Turkey, are abated and end, and that they do not engage in either actions or rhetoric that would inflame the situation. So I was just in both Turkey and Greece. Of course, Turkey had the devastating, mind-boggling earthquake. Shortly after I was in Greece, we had the horrific train accident. Our hearts and our hands actually are going to try to help both countries in both situations. But at the same time, we want to make sure that
Gentleman's
we have
time has
tensions
expired.
in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair
you,
of the
Mr.
full
Secretary.
committee, Ms. Wagner.
Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your service and your time today. Mr. Secretary, yesterday the House passed the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act. This is my bipartisan legislation I worked on with Mr. Connolly and others that requires the State Department to provide robust reporting on engagement with Taiwan and ask that the U.S. remove self-imposed barriers to engagement. I am urging my colleagues in the Senate to take up my legislation and send it to the President's desk so we can work towards tangible and sustained progress in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. The United States must demonstrate resolute and unflinching support for this important democratic partner as it faces increased bullying and coercion by the People's Republic of China. In the meantime, I hope that you will help us understand how the State Department's budget will move this critical partnership in the right direction, because I am worried, frankly, that State's current approach is overly concerned with avoiding even the slightest chance of offending Beijing. Mr. Secretary, I hope that we can all agree that our confrontation with China represents a generational challenge for the United States and its partners. However, I was concerned to see so little priority given to U.S. arms sales and other security assistance programs in the Indo-Pacific. If the Indo-Pacific is the decisive theater, why is foreign military financing for East Asia and the Pacific third in priority, with only 2% of the proposed funding going towards the region, sir?
First of all, thank you. I appreciate your focus on this. I look forward to reading what you've put forward. Let me mention just quickly, by the way, that at the beginning of this administration, we liberalized our contact guidance when it comes to our engagement with Taiwan, precisely to make sure that U.S. engagement with Taiwan better reflects the broadening, deepening unofficial relations that we have. And that guidance has been out for nearly 2 years. When it comes to the foreign military financing, sales, et cetera, just to focus on Taiwan for a second, then we can broaden out. I have signed more of these agreements than any previous Secretary of State. And in the last couple of years, we have provided for an additional $5 billion in defense-related sales to Taiwan. This builds on a long record going back over many
But yet
administrations.
that foreign aid and the weapon are not making it to Taiwan.
Well, there you have an important point. And the challenge that we're facing across the board lies not with my department, even as we work to streamline everything that we're doing. And as I said, I signed out more of these than any previous secretary. We have real production challenges across the board. Production challenges that have built up over many years as various lines have gone dormant, COVID, supply chain problems. All of these things have come to a head. That's exactly what the Defense Department, industry are working on right now. And my anticipation is you're going to see significant progress on that. But it's not for want of trying to make sure that all of our partners.
But time is of the essence, Mr. Secretary. It truly is. And the situation and the confrontation that could occur between China and Taiwan and our other partners is before us. In the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, Congress authorized up to $2 billion in this foreign military funding grants to Taiwan for each of fiscal years 2023 through 2027, which would allow the United States and Taiwan to engage in joint long-term planning for the acquisition, deployment, and sustainment of critical capabilities. Why is Taiwan not a priority ask funding or attention in FMF?
Taiwan is a priority, and as you know, we have many different ways of doing this. So we appreciate the authority. We put together in the budget a new fund to look at emerging priorities for FMF. Taiwan would be included in that. At the same time, in the case of Taiwan, the most effective way to date to make sure that they have what they need to defend themselves has been through the Foreign Military Sales Program. They increased their defense budget by 11%. They have the capabilities, the capacity to make the acquisitions they need. And at the same time, we've been working very closely with them in terms of the advice that we're providing to make sure that they have an effective deterrent and defense capacity. Sometimes that goes to significant weapon systems. Sometimes that goes to very different things that may not be the most expensive or flashiest.
And I thank you for that. And I do have some additional questions that I will submit for the record. But I do submit to you our very bipartisan Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act that was passed the House last night. I hope that the State Department, under your leadership, will take a very clear look at this. It is important as we move forward, and with the threat of China.
Thank
I
you.
thank
We
you,
will.
Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair Wagner. The chair now recognizes Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first acknowledge and thank Ms. Shamblin for being here. I know your family's from Roseville, which is approximate to my district in Sacramento County. And from what I've learned about Nicole, she loved being a Marine. She loved serving our country. She loved serving humanity. And when I think about what I love about the United States of America is I don't think about this as a Democrat or a Republican. I think about what our values are, values of freedom, of democracy, the obligations that we have in terms of global security and protecting those values around the world. So, Mr. Secretary, I want to applaud you and the administration in these first 2 years. You acknowledge that the world has changed. I mean, there are new threats out there, and I applaud the coalition building that the administration's done, keeping a coalition together in protecting and preserving the freedom of the Ukrainian people and the country there. I also want to applaud the trilateral alliance with Japan and Korea, which is at a very different place today than when you came into office, elevating the Quad coalition. And in this 21st century security architecture, it will take coalitions of like-valued countries that really do share those values, the values that Nicole held dearly, and the best way to serve her memory is to continue to preserve these American values. You're here to talk about the budget, and obviously an area that I spend a lot of time on is the competition in the Indo-Pacific. I appreciate the budget that you put forth in our competition with the People's Republic of China. In the proposal, there's $400 million in discretionary funding in the counter-PRC influence fund, but there's also over $11 billion of mandatory funding that is part of our effort to outcompete China. It's often, it's unusual to see a mandatory request in there, and I think what staff informs me is we'll have to, as a committee, put forth authorizing legislation. But I'd like to give you a chance to talk about why the mandatory funding is so important to our efforts to outcompete China.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. And I think it reflects what I'm hearing from many members of this committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, which is a recognition that when it comes to China, this is a generational challenge for us. And in our judgment, discretionary funding alone will not help us get the job done in terms of outcompeting China, where we are in intense competition. We are providing in the budget and the plan that goes along with it new and innovative ways to try to provide viable alternatives at scale that discretionary funding alone can't meet. And when I say viable alternatives, I mean things that countries around the world, potential partners, existing partners, need and are looking for, and that the United States hopefully can help provide. We've got long-term projects that need funding upfront to cover longer periods than discretionary funding allows, and the predictability and the insulation from annual fluctuations for this discrete set of programs we think would be incredibly valuable. It's a little bit modeled on what we see as the success of the CHIPS and Science Act, where the State Department was given money over 5 years to work with other countries to secure semiconductor supply chains, downstream all the way, and upstream, as well as to try to make sure that countries that were developing information communications technology were doing so in secure ways with trusted vendors so that those networks were safe and secure. That's a good model, and it's replicated more broadly in this budget request.
Well, I think it's a model that sends a signal to not only the people PRC, but to the countries in the region. Certainly the $7.1 billion for the COFA countries sends a strong signal to the Pacific Islands that America's there. We're committed. We're going to be there for the long haul, and we have their back. And again, this committee will have to work on authorizing language. I would hope that language reflects the concern with China, and that we can do that and work with the administration to make sure that that funding is there. Just in the brief time I have left, can you talk about the importance of the trilateral relationship and the place where I applaud President Yoon for his leadership as well as Prime Minister Kishida.
Yeah, I share that view, and I think for us to make sure that our two closest allies and partners in the region, Japan and Korea, not only are strengthening their relationships and partnerships with us, but are doing so between themselves and among the three of us trilaterally, further enhances not only our security, but our ability to get lots of things done around the world. We bring to bear the strengths of our three countries, of course, dealing with challenges posed by China, North Korea, but again, in so many other areas, including the provision of humanitarian assistance, including having safe and secure maritime domains, working in outer space together. There are a multiplicity of things that we're doing through this trilateral coordination. President Biden brought the two leaders together.
Gentleman's time has
and
expired.
We're doing that at every level.
I now recognize myself. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today.
Sharon?
I'm going to start with the board behind me. We have a database of individuals that are coming forward to talk about their experiences with Afghanistan. A couple weeks ago, we had Sergeant Vargas Andrews, amputee, injured in the withdrawal of Afghanistan. Nobody in any agency had asked his story whatsoever, even though he was at the tip of the spear of what had happened in the withdrawal. And so we want to hear, as we are doing oversight over what happened with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we want to hear everybody's story, any story, whether they're an SIV, whether there's somebody still stuck in Afghanistan, whether they're a Marine, a soldier, somebody that was on the wall there that was brought in to assist with SIVs, State Department, somebody that sent a descent cable. We want to hear from those individuals because it is important to us that as we do oversight over the withdrawal of Afghanistan, that we hear everybody's story, which has not happened to date. I want to start with a couple of questions, Mr. Secretary. Was Joe Biden inaugurated and sworn in as president on January 20, 2021?
Yes, he was.
And were you confirmed by the Senate on January 26, 2021?
That's correct.
And I do have a copy of your hearings. I want to reference one part of it with Senator Graham. On page 38 of it, you aptly state that any withdrawal should be based upon conditions. You can agree with that?
That was certainly the preferred course, yes.
And moving backward in time, President Trump was his team in Doha and secured an agreement with the Taliban.
That's correct.
It's been brought up many times today.
That's correct.
And that agreement, again, I have that directly in front of me. First sentence in it, peace agreement, 4 parts, guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of the soil of Afghanistan by any group or individual against the security of the United States and its allies, right? Conditions.
Yes.
So President agreed there needed to be conditions. You agreed there needed to be conditions. Nearly every member of this committee so far today has asked about Afghanistan, to include yourself bringing it up. And I just want to ask right now, will you give us a commitment that you will come back here to discuss specifically the withdrawal of Afghanistan?
Congressman, we'll make sure going forward, especially as the work of this committee and other committees continue on Afghanistan, that the State Department will be present and engaged.
Will you come back and answer questions about the withdrawal of Afghanistan?
I'm not going to prejudge that. As you know, testified on
Not a
multiple
judge.
occasions
Do you think that you should answer
year.
questions on Afghanistan, and will you?
I will certainly answer questions on Afghanistan one way or another, and whatever the appropriate.
Will you come
format
here in
is.
person and answer questions on Afghanistan?
I'm happy to take that up with the chairman and ranking member.
I think you answered to yourself. Will you come back here, if invited, to answer questions on Afghanistan?
I look forward to making sure that I and other members of the State Department provide the information needed by this committee on Afghanistan going forward for the work that you're doing.
I hope you do a better job at that than you have done to date. I want to move to a couple other questions. On April 14, 2021, President Biden announces the full withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Do you know the date that he announced for that? That he announced we would withdraw?
I believe you, did you just reference it?
The dates that he announced that we would actually
Oh, yes, I'm
withdraw.
sorry. Yes, by September 1st,
He announced by September 11.
early September, yeah.
Not early September, by September 11. That's not just any date, correct?
I think it underscores the fact that the mission that we
He
set out to
announced we would
accomplish.
withdraw on September 11, correct?
You're correct, and I think it underscores the fact.
Let's not be
the mission that
bashful
we-
about that.
No, my recollection again had been early September. I think you're correct.
He also said this. He said, I concluded it is time to end America's longest war. I concluded. He said it himself. Another quote from him, I called President Bush to inform him of my decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Was it President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan?
He's the commander-in-chief.
Absolutely. I thank you for acknowledging that. I want to move to just one other question here, and this is specific to the withdrawal. On June 24 of that year, it was announced again by President Biden that we would be drawing down to 650 troops specifically to provide security for diplomats after the main military force completes withdrawal. You understand that?
Yes, that's
being the
correct.
case? So here's my question. Of anybody that has ever spent 5 minutes or 5 hours in Afghanistan, what idiot would believe it is smart to remove the military force and leave the diplomats behind? And obviously it ended with them 50 days later having to bring back 3,000 to 8,000 troops. So what idiot decided that?
Well, pursuant to the agreement reached by the previous administration with the Taliban that called for the withdrawal of all of our forces, all of them,
What
by May
idiot
31st,
decided to pull out the main fighting force before pulling out the diplomats, which resulted in 3,000 to 8,000 additional troops being sent back into Afghanistan? What idiot decided that?
Again, Congressman, pursuant to the agreement that had been reached by the previous administration, we were to withdraw
So you're not
all
going
of
to
our
answer the
forces
question.
for,
Par for the course
from
with you.
Afghanistan.
Thank you for answering some of my questions today. I hope you'll answer more of them later. At this point, I'm going to recognize Mr. Phillips. No, Mr. Phillips, are you here? Yes.
Thank you,
Mr. Phillips is here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I lost my father in the Vietnam War when I was 6 months old in 1969. 54 years later, just last week, I was able to visit that country on the other side of the globe and actually go to the very dirt on which he took his last breaths. And you can all imagine it was one of the most extraordinary, meaningful experiences of my entire life. And I returned to Washington last night and attended an event sponsored by TAPS that honors Gold Star families, and to look at small children, American children, in the eyes who've lost loved ones in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I want to honor you, Mr. Mast, who gave so much of yourself in that effort. It's an awfully difficult thing to do. And all of us, every Gold Star family, child, brother, sister, mother, father, spends a lot of time wondering if it was worth it, if the loss of life was worth it. And I just want to thank you for being so dedicated, both personally and professionally, to doing your best to ensure that the community of Gold Star families does not expand. And I would simply ask that my colleagues on this committee, both Democrats and Republicans, as we litigate the past and hopefully learn from our mistakes, because damn it, we sure make a lot of them, that we spend equal time and energy to ensure that one day children who've lost their moms and dads in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world can also return to a country that is seeing economic growth and prosperity and safety and security, in no small part because of our investments. And to that end, Mr. Secretary, I want to speak with you about flexibility that you need to take advantage of opportunities and windows when they arise. The Middle East and North Africa Opportunity Fund, which is proposed in the new budget, would allow you to respond to opportunities as they might emerge in that region of the world. So I'm just curious how you envision using such a program, how those decisions would be made between state and USAID, and how you would prioritize that funding.
This funding in particular, these kinds of programs in general, and the flexibilities that go along with them allow us to take advantage of opportunities that come up to use our democracy and development programs to further peace, to further security, to try to create virtuous cycles. I think perhaps it was the chairman before who referenced the Abraham Accords. Sure. We have been working assiduously both to help deep-root the existing partnerships that have come from those accords, as well as to expand the circle. And part of that has been something that we put together last year that is called the Negev Forum, that brought together Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, Egypt, and that in so doing is focused on concrete projects among those countries to include the Palestinians that can effectively improve the lives of their citizens. So some of the funding that we have or are asking for would be to go to support those kinds of programs. We put together another program that actually brings, interestingly, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and India together. It's not the Middle East per se, but it draws it in. But across the board, we are looking at programs and flexibilities that allow us to address the needs, the livelihoods, the security, the opportunity for people, because when you provide that, you take away one of the usual instigators for conflict, for instability, for things that inevitably, one way or another, draw us in and cause us to spend a lot more money in so doing.
Okay. Well, I have high hopes for that, and I hope.
Thank you.
I hope we can achieve it. My second question is relative to special immigrant visas, SIVs, in Afghanistan. I don't think I'm the only one on this committee or in this entire Congress who's receiving an extraordinary number of calls to our offices from people who are trying their best to fulfill our promise to those who supported our efforts in Afghanistan and are deeply dismayed and troubled by the challenge and the backlog in obtaining those SIVs. So what is state doing to affect that? Do you need more resources? Is there anything we can do? Because it is a great challenge for all of us, and I think we are missing an important opportunity to fulfill a promise.
We're determined to do everything possible to get this right, and we've dedicated the resources, the focus to it, to make sure that we're doing that. We have well over 100 people at the department whose sole focus is this program, as well as helping others, Afghans at risk, get out of Afghanistan. We have, at present, a process that you know very well, that members of this committee know very well, that is pursuant to legislation over many years, with a dozen or so requirements in terms of moving people through the SIV process. Okay. And we've worked with Congress to streamline that, to try to make it work more effectively. We have at present a large number of people in the pipeline. Most of the people in the pipeline are at what we call the pre-chief of mission stage of this, or at the chief of mission stage. That's the point at which it's determined whether, in fact, they have met the requirements of the program. Typically, when you have people in the pipeline, we found historically that, unfortunately, about half of them wash out, which is to say it turns out they're not eligible. Sometimes that's because they are genuinely not. In other instances, people are trying to get in through that program. One of the big problems.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Documentation.
Thank
We can come back
Mr.
to
Phillips for his words.
Thank you for prioritizing.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Buck for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. During our freshman orientation years ago, when I first got to Congress, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sort of informed us of the various, the history of war, I guess. It started on land, it went to land and water, it went from land to sea to air. We are now faced with an expanded area of warfare. We're going to be looking at, evidently, cyber war and space war. It's clear that before, during, and after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, they used cyber warfare to try to shut down government functions, including public utilities, to try to shut down the banking system, the healthcare system, and other areas. It is clear that cyber war is an integral part of any of our adversaries' strategy. In addition, Facebook isn't allowed in China. The Communist Party has banned it. Western search engines like Google aren't allowed in China. The Communist Party has banned it. No Netflix in China. No Wall Street Journal in China, both being banned by the Communist Party. American businesses like Microsoft Word can only operate in China after implementing stringent restrictions that show the CCP's commitment to stifling outside ideas and to isolate information in China. America does not place similar restrictions on Chinese companies or force them to serve under such onerous conditions. ByteDance owns and operates is owned and operated by the Communist Party and is the parent company of CapCut and TikTok, two entities that gather extensive information about American citizens, including minors. Evidence shows that TikTok and CapCut collect the names, phone numbers, email addresses, IP addresses, biometric data, facial recognition, defining physical characteristics, keystroke logging that can yield bank information as well as personal medical histories, search history and proclivities, the content of messages sent on mobile devices, purchasing information about what products online somebody has purchased, file names and types of information stored in a mobile device, text messages, images, videos, any device on a clipboard, users' activities on websites and apps. Mr. Secretary, my question ultimately will be about whether we should ban TikTok and CapCut in, I should pronounce it right, I guess, CapCut in the United States. It's clear to me, and I think to most people, that cyber warfare is an important part of any future conflict with China or war with China. China, particularly the CCP, is an adversary or enemy, depending on what language you want to use, of the United States. Communist China is gathering information on Americans that can be used in the cyber war. Communist China does not allow U.S. companies to operate online apps in China. Doesn't it make sense to ban TikTok and CapCut in the U.S., and do you support such a ban?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I appreciate very much the focus that you're putting on this. Let me just say, as a preliminary matter, when it comes to TikTok, going back to July of 2021, the State Department prohibited the use on our devices of TikTok.
Thank you.
We prohibited embassy contractors, third-party vendors from using it to create or manage accounts, and we've been coordinating with partners across the board on data security policies to make sure that they're aware of this problem. As to the larger question, look, my understanding is that what has been proposed, more than proposed, insisted on, is the divestment of TikTok by the parent company. And whether that answers the mail is beyond my my capacity to evaluate. But clearly, we, the administration, and others are seized with the challenge that it poses and are taking action to address it.
Well, you say the challenge it poses. Is it a threat to the United States security?
I believe that it is, yes.
And shouldn't a threat to United States security be banned? They do it to us. Why don't we do it to them?
It should be ended one way or another, and there are different ways of doing that.
That's a very clear answer. I appreciate that very much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming before us. I guess I just wanted to ask you, start with a question about Ukraine. Last year, we passed in this body the Lend-Lease efforts when it comes to Ukraine, but I'll be honest, I haven't really heard anything about this ever since. So I guess I just wanted to ask you, has it been activated? Has it been used? How are we trying to integrate that into the efforts we're trying to deal with Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I'm not aware that that particular authority has been deemed necessary to use to date. We have, as you know, thanks to the incredible support from Congress on a bipartisan basis, and in effect the incredible support from the American people, provided very significant security assistance to Ukraine. Not only that, we've rallied other countries to do the same thing. We now have more than 50 partner countries. The security assistance that we provided, mostly through drawdowns from existing DoD accounts, has answered the needs of the Ukrainians, as well as the work that our partners are doing. In addition, there are some direct sales and other things, but the main focus has been the drawdown from DoD accounts.
I appreciate that. And if you don't mind, I'd love to be able to follow up with your team as well as with the Pentagon just about, what was the determination that this does not need to be used at this point. But I think you and I can agree, we want to make sure that we're being as forward-leaning as we can. This is such a critical year for Ukraine. It's so important that this does not drag on, because if it does drag on, that's something that very much benefits Putin, very much benefits Russia, as they have that ability to kind of wait this out. We got to make sure that that coalition will is there.
I agree with
I
you.
want to switch gears a little bit. I had a meeting recently with my constituents, and they were raising their concerns about how Russia was suspending New START, how we're seeing increased nuclear weapon development by China. And it feels like we're at this place where we're starting to slide here again after progress over previous decades on nuclear nonproliferation, on drawing that down. But you and I were both dads of young kids, and I just really worry that my kids are going to grow up in an era with just an even greater threat of nuclear weapons than the era that I grew up in. So I wanted to just get a sense from you, how central is this in your prioritization as we're thinking about global competition?
I very much share your concern. I think we have seen backsliding when it comes to arms control and nonproliferation because a number of countries have chosen to move in the wrong direction. You mentioned Russia pulling out of New START. I think that was a very regrettable and irresponsible decision. This was an agreement that benefited both of our countries in terms of its predictability, the visibility it gave us, and of course the limitations. Now, the Russians say they're going to continue to abide by the limits, but in the absence of the verification measures, obviously that makes it more challenging to be sure. Across the board, we've seen movements backward. However, at the same time, the United States has been deeply engaged with the nonproliferation treaty countries, and in fact, at the last review conference, I think we actually took steps to strengthen the nonproliferation regime. Same thing with the Biological Weapons Convention, same thing with the Chemical Weapons Convention, and there remains a strong core group of countries that want to make sure that those institutions and those agreements are upheld.
Oh, we're no doubt seeing rising challenges when it comes to this competition, especially vis-a-vis China and Russia. But as you're at the table with them, is there any appetite at all to, as we increase this as this competition unfortunately continues to increase, to try to take some of that nuclear weapon concern off the table? I mean, just
there is certainly on our behalf. I and other colleagues have engaged our Chinese counterparts on this repeatedly, saying that we should, at the very least, work on greater safety, security, visibility, risk reduction.
Well, especially when it comes to the Chinese arsenal. I mean, they are rapidly increasing, but their stocks are still significantly lower than where the United States and Russia are. So, it feels like an opportunity here to really try to press on this. And I urge you to do so.
And I agree with you. And similarly, of course, with Russians, despite the aggression in Ukraine, despite the other areas where we are in, obviously on polar opposite sides of things, we've said all along that we believe it's imperative to try to sustain and even build on arms control agreements because it's in the interest of the world as well as the interest, of course, of the American people.
I don't have any more time left, but I do want to just follow up with you after this about what we can do to make the visit of the South Korean president as successful as possible going forward.
Good.
I think that's so key, especially as we talked about regarding South Korea and Japan.
I welcome
Thanks so
that.
much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, many of the documents your department are providing are heavily redacted. Here's one of the documents you produced yesterday with no explanation for the redaction. I mean, that looks like the Kennedy assassination files or maybe a UFO file, honestly. I think it's a joke. Can you explain why it was redacted?
Congressman, I can't speak to that specific document. I can not even tell what the document is. I'm sure that we can, if there are concerns about redactions, raise them. We'll go over them. But I can't
I'm raising them. This one right here behind me on my right seems to be a talking points document with redacted answers. Can you give us any legitimate reason why the department redacted this information or refused?
Again, without looking at the specific document, I can't get into that.
Your State Department attorneys told the committee it should be grateful for having received any documents at all after a month, and that it was exceptional for a state to respond to any chairman's letters before the committee's organizing meeting. Sir, that's an insult to Congress. It's an insult to transparency. Should be an insult to the media. I believe that Gold Star families and members of Congress and the veterans deserve these answers. Do you think your attorney's statement was appropriate in any way, shape, form, or fashion?
I'm not aware of the statement. I can't speak to it. What I can tell you, though, is this. One, I am determined to make sure that this committee, other committees of Congress, receive the information that they need, particularly to conduct oversight. Second, as a matter of longstanding practice, it's at least my understanding that previously, before committees in Congress had been organized, the executive branch did not engage with those committees. Nonetheless, despite that, we began to work on requests that we knew were forthcoming before committees were organized in an effort to get ahead of things.
Sir, I would suggest to you what you need and what you say you need is in direct conflict with what Congress is asking for. You've also stated that the climate crisis is the center of your foreign policy and national security goals. With the war in Ukraine, fentanyl from China, the tensions growing over Taiwan, of course, nuclear-armed North Korea and Iran, Mexican cartels, violence against Americans, and the Taliban controlling Afghanistan, is the climate crisis still your central policy?
I'm not aware of that particular statement. I welcome seeing it. I think the issues you've just listed, which go very much to the statement I made at the beginning of this hearing, reflect the priorities that we're focused on.
Okay. Are there U.S. sanctioned personnel in Ukraine? If so, why are they receiving our tax dollars?
I'm sorry, U.S. sanctioned personnel?
Yes, sir.
In Ukraine? I'm not aware of that. I welcome any information you have.
Okay. $4 billion U.S. tax dollars have gone to Ukrainian pensions. How is that any shape, form, or fashion justifiable?
The program, Congressman, of assistance to Ukraine has on the ground right now in our embassy about 47 personnel responsible solely for oversight. We just had a report by the Inspector General's office looking at the oversight of the taxpayers' funds in Ukraine. The report was very positive in terms of the processes that are in place and the work that's being done to make sure that money is being spent appropriately as well as wisely. At the same time, we have in place a process. For example, much of the funding that we provide, the taxpayers provide to Ukraine, goes through a World Bank program that only disperses money upon receipts for authorized expenditures. And we have third-party validators, to include Deloitte, which is working directly with the Ministry of Finance.
I appreciate all that, but when we can't fund Medicare and then we're funding Ukrainian pensions, I really think our priorities are out of whack. Let me move on if I could. A constituent of mine, Staff Sergeant Ryan Canals, he was actually the last person who was killed in Afghanistan. He was killed at Abbey Gate. Why can't his family know the full story of his death?
Again,
Can somebody get with me on that? Because it's very aggravating to me. The family is they're neighbors of mine.
I deeply appreciate that, Congressman. I would refer you to, I think, other departments that would be able to.
Okay. Let me ask you one quick more question. Are you aware of Chinese spy equipment on U.S. infrastructure, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico? And what's your plan to stop the Chinese spying on domestic infrastructure?
This is at the top of our priority list, and making sure that any adversary competitor that would be engaged in undermining our cybersecurity, that we're dealing with that effectively, both in terms of our own government institutions, including my department, where we've elevated that as a priority, as well as partners around the world who, for example.
Well, what's your plan to stop it?
So we're deeply engaged with countries, including Mexico, to make sure, for example, that they do not take untrusted vendors into their communications networks in ways that could impact our security.
This is on U.S. infrastructure, not Mexican infrastructure.
Again, I'd refer you to the Department of Homeland Security, to the other agencies that focus on this. I'd also welcome seeing the information that you have. I'm happy to follow up on it.
Please have someone contact me.
We'll do that. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today and for your service to our country. Mr. Secretary, we are experiencing a frightening global rise in anti-Semitism, including violent attacks against Jews and Jewish institutions, the spreading of conspiracy theories online, the scapegoating of Jews for the pandemic, for a wide variety of problems, and greater peril for Jews around the world. The Pew Research Center just released a report with evidence of increased anti-Jewish hate and harassment in 94 countries around the world. And the ADL just released a report showing a dramatic increase in anti-Semitism, hatred, and violence across the U.S., including on college campuses. We have in our special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, Ambassador Lipstadt, a highly qualified and highly motivated person who has embraced her job and traveled around the world. But we understand from her that her office is hampered by lack of resources. They are having to use contract people rather than being able to hire their own staff. So I'm asking for a commitment from you to evaluate whether additional funding is needed for her office, as we have requested, a number of us have requested in a letter, to increase the resources for that office to work on this critical issue.
First of all, I share your deep concern about this both personally as well as professionally. Second, Ambassador Lipstadt is extraordinary. We're very fortunate to have her, the leading expert of her generation on the question, and she's doing a remarkable job. Third, yes, we'll certainly look to make sure that the resources are there for her to do her job as effectively as she can.
Thank you for that. And we have a very active bipartisan task force to combat anti-Semitism here in the House. We have engaged with the second gentleman, and we are anxious to work with the Biden administration's interagency task force to combat anti-Semitism, and we hope that you will be engaged in that as well. I want to go to something that my colleague, Mr. Phillips, raised. You detailed you detailed the very important work that is being done to strengthen the Abraham Accords in response to one of his comments. With the working groups that have come out of the Negev Summit, the opportunities for the Abraham Accord countries to work together on issues that are critical to building strong relationships and stronger economies for all of those countries that are participating. Of course, the one major player in the region that has not joined the Abraham Accords is Saudi Arabia. And there were great hopes that bringing Saudi Arabia into the Accords would enhance the effectiveness of those accords, create a security alliance to counter the malign activities of Iran. And as we all know, China recently brokered a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. How do you view that new development, and what impact do you think it will have on the future growth of the Abraham Accords?
Thank you. First, as you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been talking for several years about seeing if they could restore their diplomatic relations. Those relations were cut off, I think, back in 2016 when Saudi Arabia put to death a prominent Shia cleric, and then there was an attack on the Saudi embassy in Iran. No surprise, diplomatic relations were suspended. So they've been talking in Oman, they've been talking in Baghdad. In terms of China's role, they, to the best of our understanding, in effect hosted the final session that led to the agreement. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, what I'll say is this. To the extent that that agreement, if implemented, and that's a question mark, if implemented, actually does reduce some tensions and curbs some of the deeply objectionable Iranian behavior, particularly, for example, attacks on Saudi Arabia, facilitating attacks by the Houthis on Saudi Arabia, where, by the way, we have 80,000 American citizens, that would be a good thing. And countries around the world, to include China, if they act responsibly in trying to help bring countries together to lessen tensions, reduce conflict, that's a good thing. As I said, I have some questions about whether this will be implemented, but if it is, that will be a modest gesture. Now, on the Abraham Accords, I don't think it affects them, which is to say that we are very focused both on deepening the accords among the existing participants and broadening it. And of course, Israel makes no secret that it hopes that Saudi Arabia would sign on at some point, and that remains an objective. President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, I think, helped further the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and we'll look to see in the months ahead, hopefully more progress on that. Again, that would be good for Israel. It would be good for Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I do have specific questions about your budget with regard to the use of the Middle East and North Africa Opportunity Fund. We will submit those to your office. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. In the readouts from your February 18th meeting with the top Chinese diplomat, Wang Yi, it is noted that you raised the spy balloon as a violation of U.S. sovereignty and violation of international law. We thank you for that. But it's clear from our own State Department that the CCP never gave an explanation for the balloon in your meeting, and that in this meeting, to their understanding, they said it, quote, paved the way for the resumption of future high-level dialogue between the two sides, and the two countries can now talk beyond the balloon issue and come back to the negotiating table on other pressing issues. That does not sound like you offered any deterrence whatsoever for future incursions into our airspace. Why is that a concern? because this balloon flew over Malmstrom Air Force Base, our nuclear triad, Minot Air Force Base, Warren Air Force Base, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, headquartered to STRATCOM, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Whiteman Air Force Base, where our B-2s are, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, Fort Campbell in my state of Kentucky, Arnold Air Force Base, Tennessee, Camp Frank D. Merrill, Georgia, Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina, Joint Base Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Secretary, this spy balloon should have been shot down as soon as it entered the U.S. air defense zone north of Alaska's Aleutian Islands on January 28th. Tell me specifically what your plan is to prevent further PRC incursions into the U.S. homeland.
We told our Chinese counterparts, I told them directly, that the balloon flying over the United States, the spy balloon flying over the United States, was unacceptable and could not happen again. And we are determined to make sure that it doesn't. Not only that, as you know, we were able to expose the entire program, a program that affected more than 40 countries across 5 continents. That resulted not just in us, but many other countries going into China and making clear their opposition to what China was doing and its unacceptability. I think the fact that that program has been exposed for the world to see has clearly put the brakes on it.
Well,
we will take whatever action is appropriate in any given circumstance to protect the security of the United States. In this particular circumstance, as colleagues have laid out, we made a determination, first of all, when it was clear the balloon was flying over sensitive sites, we made a determination to, first of all, protect those sites with measures that were taken. Second, to make sure that at the earliest opportunity, in ways that did not endanger the population on the ground.
Well, if I may interject,
take down
Mr.
that balloon, and
Secretary,
that's exactly what we did.
I appreciate your dialogue, but and as you noted, there was no apology. Not that we were expecting an apology, but the fact that we didn't shoot it down before it entered our airspace over the Pacific, not over the Atlantic, was an invitation for further incursions. Talk is cheap. Deterrence requires force. When our airspace and our sovereignty is at issue, let me move on to another question.
I agree with you. Once something is in our airspace or in our sovereignty,
this week's summit
we
between
need to take
Putin
action.
and this week's summit between Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping reinforced the no limits relationship between those two authoritarian regimes. In fact, Xi described the visit as a new chapter in strengthening relations between Beijing and Moscow. They are saying that this was portrayed in China as a bold initiative to create a new world order. In your meeting with China's top diplomat, Wang, you warned about the implications and consequences if China provided material support to Russia for its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But on February 27th, we finally received the required report from my Access Act giving full unclassified assessment of China's support of Russia's illegal full invasion of Ukraine. And that report said that Russian custom records indicated PRC firms have provided Russian entities with restricted and dual-use products which can be used in Russia's prosecution of its war against Ukraine. Chinese state-owned defense companies have shipped navigation equipment, jamming technology, jet fighter parts to sanctioned government-owned defense companies. New York Times, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has sold more than $12 million in drones and drone parts to the country. And then according to Trade and Customs data, Chinese companies, including one connected to the government of Beijing, have sent Russian entities assault rifles and other equipment that could be used for military purposes. So my question is, why are you then just saying on February 18th, you're just warning of consequences for providing Russia material support when the State Department comes out 9 days later with an entire year's worth of unclassified evidence of China's material support to Russia?
Congressman, we're focused on lethal material support being provided by the Chinese state to the Russians.
Looks like lethal support.
And we're also tracking the provision by private enterprises of dual-use technology that could be of concern. So this is a
I think we need to sanction China for their lethal support. It's not just buying the oil and buying the gas. We have documented trade records, custom records of providing lethal support now. We need to get tougher on the CCP. They are financing this war in Russia, and they are providing lethal support. According to this Trade and Customs data, we need action, and I urge this administration to follow suit. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Sherfilius McCormick. I hope I got that right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Blinken, thank you so much for being here. The political and economic climate in Haiti is deteriorating significantly in recent years. The situation is so severe that nearly 20,000 people in Port-au-Prince are facing famine food insecurity, the first in our hemisphere record history. Insecurity is driving up the cost of delivering aid or making some areas completely inaccessible. Humanitarian actors, including Haitian-led NGOs, civil society, and are working tirelessly to meet the needs of people, but a political solution is required to address the full scale of this crisis. In addition, from January to mid-March, 531 people were killed and 300 injured by gang incidents. How does the budget request reflect the department's outlook on the political solution to the crisis in Haiti? And if it does, how does it prioritize it?
Thank you. We have at least two, if not more, interconnected problems, and you point to the two main ones. We need a political way forward in Haiti that produces a fully legitimate government that's able to do the business of the Haitian people. At the same time, given the absence of security, given the profound insecurity, it's very hard for Haitians to move forward on a political track, never mind conduct elections. And the profound insecurity is driven primarily by the fact that gangs have authority over critical parts of Port-au-Prince, other major cities, gangs who are doing, in many cases, the bidding of political and other elites, and at the same time are overwhelming, in many cases, the Haitian National Police. So we have been working on a number of things to try to reverse the situation. One, we're trying to break the nexus between some of these elites and the gangs with a very focused sanctions approach to go at those elites, and not just us. Canada, other countries are focused on doing this with us. Second, we've been working to support, strengthen, build up the Haitian National Police, again, with other countries, through training, through the provision of equipment, et cetera. That has been a challenging process. We continue to work on it, and more needs to be done. Third, our diplomats are engaged with the Haitian government and key stakeholders in Haiti to try to move forward on the political track and to try to find some kind of agreement among them, including with the Montana Group, that would allow them to move forward with elections, assuming that the security situation improves. So we're working on all of those tracks. We have resources in the budget to help provide for that. It's primarily a function in this moment of our diplomacy and also diplomacy with other countries to get them engaged in supporting the Haitian people.
Thank you. And also this week, Ranking Member Gregory Meeks and I introduced the Haiti Criminal Collusion Transparency Act, which requires the Secretary of State to submit an annual report to Congress regarding the ties between criminal gangs and political economic elites in Haiti, imposing sanctions on political and economic elites involved in such criminal activity. How does the budget address the corruption and the collusion taking place in Haiti? In addition to that, have you seen any advancement when it comes to governance and a transition government?
So, yes, I think you underscore the very important point that trying to break this nexus between political elites and the gangs is critical. And that's exactly what our focus has been. And it's primarily been with directly targeting those elites that are supporting gangs or trying to use them to advance their own purposes, including denying them the ability to come to the United States, going after their assets here. Many of the people in question like to go back and forth. So I think that focus has some real potential. And as I said, our diplomats are deeply engaged, working both with the government, with stakeholders like the Montana Group, to see if we can help support an agreed way forward on getting to elections.
Since being elected to Congress, I've led charge on many issues concerning the Republic of Haiti. In December, a few of my colleagues went on a CODEL to the UN, where we were briefed on dire situation in Haiti. It was during these briefings that there were many conversations about a potential intervention. Does this budget have any, allow any money for the potential intervention to the Republic of Haiti?
So what we're looking at, and we're talking to a number of other countries, to include Canada, is what would be necessary to, again, help strengthen the Haitian National Police and help improve the security environment so that the political process can move forward. There's been discussion of some kind of multinational force at the United Nations, something that we're actively, the discussion that we're actively participating in. The President will be going to Canada tonight, in fact, where we'll pursue conversations with the Canadian government about what we might do together along with other countries, CARICOM countries, countries in the region, to support that, but we're looking at the best ways that we can find, again, to deal with the insecurity problem. First and foremost, that really goes to bolstering the HNP, the Haitian National Police, but we are looking at whether additional measures need to be taken. And if that's the case, and we're not there yet, we will make sure that they're properly resourced.
And my final question, which I'll be submitting to your office, is about the gender-based violence that we're seeing skyrocketing in Haiti, and if the budget will be addressing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Happy to look at that. Thank you very much.
Gently yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Green.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, Mr. Secretary. I want to thank you for appearing here. I was encouraged to hear in your testimony that you want to restore Congress's pivotal role in foreign policy process. That's a goal that you and I share. But if that's a genuine goal or desire of yours, two things have to happen. Firstly, it'd be great if you could appear before us more than once a year. That would be greatly appreciated. We enjoy the dialogue. I know you and I have had some agreements where we've talked about things, and of course my nearshoring bill, your department did a wonderful job providing some input on that. But secondly, I think you should own some of the mistakes. I think it would give you incredible credibility if you did that. Both mistakes made and mistakes being made. One of the worst decisions, and I want to take an opportunity to point this out, I think the State Department has made is abandoning the asylum cooperation agreements that were negotiated with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras under the previous administration. I think this was one of the first actions that you took in office back in February of 21, and it's been one of the most damaging to our homeland security, and I speak as the chair of that committee. As you know, there are currently no legal mechanisms to return a migrant to a transitory country they pass through on their way to the United States. Despite a humanitarian crisis on our border with Mexico, you withdrew from essential agreements with our allies that were stemming the scourge of human trafficking and the flow of lethal drugs through Central America. And I think that's both shameful and preventable. The border chief just recently gave testimony to the Committee on Homeland Security, and he identified the empowerment of the cartels by using mass waves of people to control 5 of our 9 sectors on our southwest border due to the loss of the ability, one of the reasons, to return people. And the termination of these return agreements has been a complete and utter disaster, I believe, on many of the metrics that you in this budget process say you support. You said you were pursuing a free, secure, and I'm quoting, free, secure, open, and prosperous world. But I want to tell you that we don't get a prosperous, free world when you allow cartels to smuggle narcotics and traffic migrants across the Western Hemisphere and into our country. You've also allowed our relationships with Latin American countries to deteriorate. I look at the many, I would say the metastasis of Cuba's Huela across Latin America. And for instance, just recently, here's an example, Mexico with its increasingly becoming lawless puppet of the cartels almost. I mean, the Mexican military just recently illegally seized the private property of an American company, a company with significant presence in my district in Tennessee. And rather than working to stop those violent cartels and deadly fentanyl taking American lives, Mexico is using its military and law enforcement to occupy private property of American citizens, American businesses. And that's really unacceptable. And it shows how the perpetual weakness that we sometimes portray in this administration is emboldening the Mexican government's lawlessness. My first question to you is on fentanyl, and it's killed over 70,000 Americans just last year. The Mexican cartels primarily use Chinese-sourced precursor chemicals in what is the most surveilled society on the planet. They can't tell us where that's coming from. I'd like to ask what steps in 2023 the department plans to take to counter the cartel's production and trafficking of fentanyl into the United States.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I really do appreciate it because I share not only your deep concern, this is an absolute top priority for us, as I know it is for you. And as you point out, fentanyl is the #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49. We see the devastating consequences of having it community after community. We seized more fentanyl last year, or enough fentanyl last year to kill every single American. So yes, we're seized with this. Let me
and
just
you
say,
understand, just I don't mean to interrupt,
please,
but
go ahead.
You do understand that it's those increased seizures are a neutralization attack from the cartels. I mean, they're flooding the crossing sites, so your numbers are going to go up. The CBP's being thinned and put at those crossing sites because they have to, because of those mass waves run by the cartels, and that's allowing more fentanyl to come in. I mean, the dollar price of fentanyl in my district, according to our sheriffs, went from $95 in January of 21 to $28. So that means the supply, you get it. Okay.
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate that. Let me just say very quickly, this is hugely important, and we want to work with you on this. We are engaged in a comprehensive approach. Obviously, the things that we're doing at home to reduce demand, increase treatment, provide antidotes are usually important, but while necessary, obviously insufficient. We have the border itself, as you know from your work, at least according to DHS, about 95% of the fentanyl coming into the United States from Mexico is coming through legal points of entry. We have technology that you, I know, are well aware of that can help us better detect the efforts to smuggle through points of entry this fentanyl, which is being deployed. Third, we are working with Mexico to try to disrupt the cartels, to try to disband the places where fentanyl is being manufactured. Mexico is usually security challenged. That is no secret. They have put increased resources into this. Their seizures of fentanyl are up. The forces they have deployed to deal with it are up. We put together last year a joint program to bring our resources together to deal with this in Mexico, to include also bringing in other agencies that are critical. Let me just very quickly do two things. Third, because or fourth, excuse me. The international beyond Mexico component of this is usually important, and that goes to China. One of the things that we know is happening is that legal precursors are being diverted into illicit use to manufacture synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So I have seized the G20, the 20 leading economies in the world, to include China on this. We just had a foreign ministers meeting where, for the first time, fentanyl was put front and center on the agenda. We'll be establishing a working group to bring these countries and the private sector together to work on this. One of the things that we can do effectively, I believe, that we haven't done in the past, information sharing, labeling, know your customers, so that companies that are unintentionally having their products diverted into illegal use will have a way of dealing more effectively with this. Now, one way or another, we need to bring China into this.
Yes,
My hope would be cooperatively, but in the absence of that, we have to look at other steps that we can take.
On a separate note, and I'll be very quick, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to connect with your office about some cyber stuff that sits in both as I straddle being on this great committee with this great chairman and serve in Homeland Security. I have some ideas I'd like to run by you.
I'd welcome that. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Dean. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for this hearing today. Welcome, Secretary Blinken. Mrs. Herrera, I did want to also offer my heartfelt sympathy and the heartbreak of our nation on the loss of Marine Sergeant Nicole Gee. What a beautiful and powerful woman. We share your pride. I really thank the chairman for allowing you to express more information about what the State Department is doing, about my colleague's concern about fentanyl and the illicit use of the precursors, as well as the transportation. As you point out, 95% of the fentanyl pouring into this country is coming through legal ports of entry. Sadly, many times in the hands or behind the wheel is an American. So I did want to let you know that we have recently begun a bipartisan fentanyl prevention caucus. Love to work with you and the State Department on it. Representative Issa of this committee, Representative Calvert, Joe Neguse, and I are co-chairing that important
Really welcome
committee.
that.
Thank you. I'd look forward to doing that. In the little time that I have, I wanted to quote what I read last night in your testimony and what you said again today. We meet at an inflection point. There is an intense competition underway to determine what comes next. The United States has a positive vision for the future, a world that is free, secure, open, and prosperous. And I thank you and the administration for that vision, for that mission. I wanted to say you also read, and remember this is about your budget request, and I want to root my questions in your budget request to be as effective as we can be. You say the budget will help us push back on advancing authoritarianism and democratic backsliding. Two areas of the world of conflict that I want to talk about, they're quite different, are Ukraine and Israel. In both cases, the United States is the indispensable nation. As I have visited Israel or nations near Ukraine, That is what everyone tells us, and it is not a haughty statement. It is a statement of truth. I'm proud of the administration for bringing together more than 50 nations for Ukraine. And my ambition, like I think so many others, is that we, this indispensable nation, bringing together a coalition, bring an end to this war as quickly as possible, that it not be a sustained war. So tell us about the State Department budget request, and what can that budget request do? What can the diplomatic efforts do and are doing right now to make sure we bring a quick end to the war in Ukraine?
Thank you, Congressman. First, we didn't want this war. We did everything possible to try to prevent it. I engaged in intense diplomacy with my Russian counterpart, our Russian counterparts, so did other members of the administration. We tried to address concerns the Russians purportedly had about security, just as we insisted that they address ours. Unfortunately, it became apparent, and you don't have to take my word for it, President Putin says it directly, that this was never about concerns Russia had about its security coming from NATO or coming from Ukraine, of all things. It was always about Putin's belief that Ukraine is not an independent country, that it needs to be erased from the map and subsumed into Russia as part of a greater Russian empire. And that's exactly what he set out to do, and that's exactly what we've stopped. Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, is clearly established. It's not going anywhere. Ukrainians are not going anywhere. But, of course, exactly where this settles and how it settles is usually important. And in my judgment, and in the judgment of the administration, we desperately want to see peace, although Ukrainians want it more than anyone. They're the ones who are subjected to this aggression every single day. But it needs to be a just and durable peace. And by just, I mean a peace that reflects the basic principles that underlie the international system and the United Nations Charter: territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence. And it needs to be durable in the sense that we don't want this to settle in a place where it's easy for Russia to just rest, refit, and then re-attack 6 months, a year, 2 or 3 years later. So those elements are critical. If we saw any indication that Russia was ready and prepared for meaningful diplomacy to end its aggression, we would jump on it. Unfortunately, what we've seen to date is the absolute absence of that evidence.
Forgive me, because my time is so short, I do want to ask you about Israel, another country that suffers with its own security from without and the threat of its erasure, but it also is struggling internally. I want to echo the words of President Biden in a comment to the New York Times last month. The genius of American democracy and Israeli democracy is that they are both built on strong institutions, checks and balances, and an independent judiciary. As we know, there are troubling crises in Israel. What is it that the United States can do, and I know there was a conversation or conversations held yesterday, to push back against what's going on to undermine institutions and to undermine an independent judiciary there at the peril of Israeli citizens, both Jews and Arabs, both Israelis and Palestinians? What are we doing to move forward with a two-state solution? Is there any hope?
So first, we see the extraordinary vibrancy of Israel's democracy every single day as they have this debate about the future of their judiciary. And that's to Israel's credit. As Israel's closest friend and strongest supporter, we talk about these issues all the time. And as President Biden said, I think very aptly and very eloquently, for both of us, when we're looking at very significant reforms, I think we both found in our history that the best way to have a sustainable outcome that people support is to try to find consensus, and consensus usually requires compromise on all sides. So our hope is that that's what they'll do, but it's not for us to tell them what to do or how they should do it. They have a strong democratic system.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I
And if I could
apologize.
follow up.
Mr. Secretary, we
happy to.
want to keep you on time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
1:30.
Thank you.
So Chair recognizes Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here with us, and it's good to see you. The Biden administration has highlighted the Indo-Pacific as critical to U.S. national security. And in the Biden National Security Strategy, the Indo-Pacific's importance is highlighted, stating, quote, "No region will be of more significance to the world and to everyday Americans than the Indo-Pacific," end quote. Yet, In the fiscal year 2024 diplomatic programs budget, the East Asian and Pacific Affairs was the 4th largest bureau. So why is it that the department is saying that the Indo-Pacific is the most important region, but treating it as the 4th most important?
Well, I think one of the things, thank you, Congressman. I think you're exactly right that for us, this is in many ways the most dynamic, fastest growing region in the world. We know that's generated about 75% of economic growth in recent years. Trading partners, investment partners, and obviously strategically, usually important. And we are a Pacific nation ourselves.
Sure.
But precisely because of that, we have infused the work that we are doing in the Indo-Pacific across all of our bureaus. And so as a result of that, we have in bureaus like the European Affairs Bureau now expertise on the Indo-Pacific so that they can work, for example, with colleagues in Europe to make sure that we are coordinated and that we're approaching these issues in the same way
So
together.
I want to know what resources you intend to use and devote to supporting human rights, like in Xinjiang, and stopping the genocide of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities by the CCP.
So this
That's
is-
important area for me.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think this is, again, a central focus of our diplomacy. We have put a spotlight on the genocide being committed against Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang, the abuses that are being committed. We, of course, have declared it such. We have rallied other countries to sanction China for the actions that it's taking there, which has resulted in reactions from Beijing against those countries, including the use of economic coercion, which we're also combating. We have our own human rights report that I personally put out every single year, including last week, that, among other things, continues to highlight this and expose it.
Thank you
so
for
that countries
continuing
take
to
action.
highlight that. Thank you so much. And I want to talk about the very important issue too in Taiwan area. You know, last year I spearheaded and got signed into law the Arms Exports Delivery Solutions Act that calls upon the State Department to find ways to expedite arms sales to Taiwan. And in your budget, you propose a budget increase for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs that oversees arms sales and foreign military sales. So what is the State Department's plan to use that proposed increase in budget to speed up the arms sales to Taiwan? I mean, we are thankful that the Biden administration has stated that we will allow Taiwan to purchase more, but I think that just underscores the need to deliver what they already purchased and pay for.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that, and I also appreciate what you did. One of the things that we've worked on and that I've directed the Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs to do is to look at what we can do and as our part of the process to streamline the work that we're doing on arms sales for a couple of reasons. One, as you've noted, because it's so critically important in the case of Taiwan to make sure that it has the means to deter and defend against any possible aggression. But beyond that, we also have countries now in different parts of the world that are rethinking longstanding relationships with other countries, particularly Russia, and are looking to see what direction they might move in. Part of that goes to making sure that they have the equipment that they need to defend themselves, and that often goes to us. So we're looking at this across the board. I will say that, first, if you look at what's going on, the longest pole in the tent when it comes to this is production. Now, there are process issues that are real and that we're working to streamline, but principally, the longest pole in the tent by far is the actual production for a whole variety of reasons. There's a big focus on that. In our case,
I appreciate that, but I do have one important issue
please.
that I want to bring up, but I do want to also thank you, but please find out what the delay is, and then let's deliver what they already pay for. That's what I'm talking about.
Yep.
But Evan Hernandez is an LA-based attorney who was wrongfully detained in Venezuela in March 2022. Last year, I signed a letter led by Representative Baz and Barragan calling on the President Biden to take the necessary steps to bring Evan home. So can you provide me with an update on this wrongful detention and steps your administration is taking to secure his release?
Yeah, I share your determination to bring him home, to bring any wrongfully detained American home. I actually spoke with the family myself. I think it was in late January. We have a team that I think you know well that engages with the family on a very regular basis, led by Roger Carstens. He and the head of our Venezuela Affairs Unit have been to Venezuela on multiple occasions to try to secure the release of those who are being wrongfully detained. As you know, we were able to bring home a number of Americans who had been wrongfully detained by Venezuela. We will continue that effort until we bring Ivan and any others home.
Thank
And
you.
I thank you for keeping the spotlight on that.
Chair recognizes Ms. Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. It's great to see you. We've heard a lot of talk here today about Afghanistan. A key thing that came out of our last hearing on Afghanistan was the need for the State Department to actually be resourced to have the capacity that we needed to have to the missions we're asking it to do. And I think a big part of that is us in Congress having culpability for looking at how we've historically underfunded and underinvested in the State Department and our development efforts. And as we move forward to look at strategic competition, I think we need to make sure that we don't make the same mistake. So, Mr. Secretary, if you look at our investments in the State Department over, say, the past 10 years, how would you characterize them versus the need?
Well, it won't surprise you that while we've made real progress, especially the last 2 years, which I'm grateful to Congress for on a bipartisan basis, we can always do more, and we should always try to do more. Having said that, of course, we have to be responsible stewards of the taxpayers' money. The budget that we put forward, I think, is an accurate reflection of what we believe we need to not only sustain but strengthen all of these programs, and we look forward to working with Congress, hopefully to achieving it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm very supportive of the 14% increase that you all have asked for. If you look at the investments we've made over the past 10 years, how does that compare with that of China? Have they been increasing their investments in development and diplomacy?
Dramatically. And we've seen a dramatic investment by China in terms of both the resources that they put into this, as well as their presence. One of the reasons that we are determined, for example, to build back or build up our presence in the Pacific Islands is precisely because they're there and we're not. We've opened up in the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, we're looking at Kiribati, Tonga. We need to be there. But across the board, we see this. But I also want to make something clear because it's important. When it comes, for example, to some of the investments that China is making in other countries, they have the ability in their system to direct state resources at it. Our system is different. What we can do, and I think can do effectively, is to serve as a catalyst primarily for the private sector to be more engaged in critical areas. And that's what we're working on. We have tools like the Development Finance Corporation that are, I think, critical to doing that. One of the things that we'd like to see is lifting some of the existing restrictions on the DFC so that it can better deploy its equity investments, which will leverage 10 times, 100 times that from the private sector. That's our comparative advantage, and we need to be able to seize it.
Well, we are supportive of that as well. I was just hoping you could quickly talk to the committee about how the disparity in the way we've invested in diplomacy and the way China has invested in diplomacy is impacting our ability to strategically compete around the world.
Well, again, part of it goes to our actual presence, and we also very much appreciate some of the new authorities that we have for the State Department to establish new posts, and also to find ways to manage risks that are in a reasonable way, including with the construction of new facilities. But it does go to not just to the presence, but it goes to what we were just talking about. It goes to the resourcing of these programs, and I think we have to be smart and effective about it. By which I mean, one, leveraging the private sector; two, leveraging partners and allies. One of the things that we've done, just to give you a quick example, Mineral Security Partnership. We put together a coalition of countries so that we can pool our information and to some extent pool our resources to make sure that we and other like-minded and friendly countries are making investments around the world in critical minerals that we want to make sure no country has a monopoly on, given how important they are to a 21st century economy, including semiconductors.
Yeah, well, as the ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee, I can tell you firsthand, I've heard from many of our partner countries that they've noticed the lack of American investment in the African continent and other places, and are eager to see our presence grow. Just really quickly, I appreciated that you mentioned in your opening remarks about the Diplomatic Support and Security Act, my bill, which we passed last term, which would relieve and incentivize the department to be less risk-averse. Has the department communicated this specific congressional action to the Overseas Diplomatic Corps?
To the Foreign Diplomatic Corps?
To our diplomatic
To our own Diplomatic Corps?
Yep.
Yes, very much so. One of the things we've, in fact, I think I recently referred to these new authorities in a communication with our personnel. We have people around the world who want to make sure that we're leaning in and want to make sure that we have the ability to do that, while, of course, managing risk appropriately. My top job, of course, is looking out for the security and safety of our people, but we also want to make sure that we're engaged and managing risks in a smart way.
Well, I appreciate that, and I look forward to working together to make sure the RSOs and others have what they need to be able to get our folks out and doing their job. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Ms. Salazar.
Wonderful to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Sure, I'm sure you are. So, 4 countries in Latin America, and we'd love for you to short answers because you know we have 5 minutes. Dominican Republic. Do you think that the actual government for the Dominican Republic is racist? Yes or no?
The government of the Dominican Republic? No, we have concerns about the treatment of Haitian population, but the government, no.
But then, Mr. Secretary, you have told the African Americans in this country not to travel to the island, and that happened last November.
We had a security concern, and my number one responsibility, besides looking out for my own people, is looking out for Americans. We worked with the government of the Dominican Republic repeatedly, well in advance of putting that notice out, to try to address the concerns that had been raised. But we got to a point where we felt it was important to make sure that people could look out for their safety and
For you to put a
security.
travel ban and affect their economy, tourism specifically, you need to have some proof. And Chairman McCall and myself, we've asked the State Department to provide that proof, and you have not provided any. So, having said that, you have the power to retract that ban. Are you planning to do that anytime soon?
We will do it based on
When?
the facts. I can't know.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. The fact, we have been asking for you to prove to us, Chairman McCall and myself, to provide the evidence that proves that the Dominican Republic government is affecting African Americans, and you guys have not provided anything.
We'll look to see what information we have that we
You don't
can
have any
share.
because I've been asking you, and you have not provided. Meaning
Again,
your
these
department.
determinations are made, and we worked with the government of the Dominican Republic to try to
By
address
when
them
do you think
before.
that you will make a decision whether to keep the ban or to retract?
It depends entirely on the facts, whether
There are no
steps
facts?
Well, there are
So,
facts.
okay, why
because
don't we
the
do
decision
something?
was made
Why
on that.
don't you then provide to Chairman McCall and myself the facts that prove to you, to the State Department, that the Dominican Republic is really affecting African Americans? Can
By
we?
the way, it's also not a travel ban. It's an alert.
Hey,
An alert
listen,
means
it's
people
the
should-
same effect, my friend.
Well,
it's affecting a lot of.
There were
it's affecting
multiple, there
that
were multiple
government.
cases of concern, which I'll make sure we share with you.
Please do. Could you please share that with us? Could you commit that
We
you're
will
gonna
share the
the
cases
truth?
of concern that
Thank you.
raised this.
Let's go to Cuba. There are rumors that the United States is preparing to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states. That would mean that the Cuban regime would then have a series of more ability to borrow money, to gain oxygen for the repressive apparatus. Is the State Department planning to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states? Yes or no?
We are not planning to remove them from the list.
Good.
Let me just be very clear.
Yes.
For the sake of clarity. As you know, there is no automatic or required review. There are a number of members who've been interested in this question. The law provides very clear criteria to rescind designations. There is an extremely high bar to do that.
So do you think that up to this hour, Cuba has met or not met that high bar?
As we speak, it clearly is not.
Good. So that means that you commit right now in public under oath that the State Department is not planning to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states.
What I commit to is to if there is to be such a review, it will be based on the law and based on the criteria in the law established by Congress. And as I said, it's a very high bar.
Good. So then I interpret that you are not thinking about doing that in the near future. Thank you. Now let's go to Argentina. You know that there is a Chinese military satellite station in Argentina. Chinese military satellite station. That sounds really scary. You know, because I'm sure that the Chinese are not looking at the stars. All right. So last month, your assistant secretary told me that he had never heard of it. And we're talking about the size of 500 football fields in Patagonia. So in 2019, I mean, that's a few years ago, the Pentagon said that that base was a threat. No kidding. It's a Chinese military satellite station in our hemisphere. Do you know anything about it?
I'm happy to follow up with you on that.
What do you
of course,
mean?
Of course, I was not here in 2019, so I'm not aware of
No,
what
I
was said
understand,
then.
but you are now the head of the State Department,
so
and
I'm
we're
hap-
talking about
we're-
a satellite station right there next to us in this same hemisphere.
So we're focused around the world, including in our own hemisphere, on any concerns that we have about the placement of...
Sir, I'm asking you, have you spoken with the Argentinians? Because you know something, the Argentinians cannot even walk into that. Could you imagine having a Chinese military satellite station in Argentina and the Argentinian government cannot even visit it? What do you think the Chinese are doing?
I welcome following up
Cupcakes?
with you.
So what can we do above this?
I welcome following up with you. Thank you.
Say that again, sir.
I welcome following up with you on that.
Please do. Thank you, sir. I think my time has expired to your benefit. Thanks.
Let me say, the secretary has till 1:30, I think maybe a little bit longer with the other hearing at 2 that you have. But I would ask if we cannot get UC from the minority to limit questions to 3 minutes. But I would ask that everybody try to be as brief as possible so I can get to all the members. Chair recognizes Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here today. There are several topics I'd like to cover in the short amount of time, but let me start with a simple thank you. Brittany Griner is an important part of the Arizona community, someone I know well. She's a friend of mine, and I want to thank the President, the team at the State Department, the SPHA team, as well as you personally, Mr. Secretary, for your commitment to securing her return to the United States. My staff worked closely with your team throughout the process, and I cannot say enough about SPHA's professionalism and commitment to returning wrongfully detained Americans, and I am truly in awe. And as we both know, there are many more wrongfully detained Americans abroad, including Paul Whelan, and I am fully committed to supporting you and SPHA to giving you the tools to work towards the return of our fellow citizens. My first question is about Afghanistan. Mr. Secretary, I'm sure you know better than anyone that one of the most important things our nation needs, and you need personally when carrying out our diplomatic mission, is credibility. When we issue a guarantee, we better deliver, and we have an obligation to take care of those who help protect our nation's security. 2 weeks ago, this committee heard about the continued struggles facing our Afghan allies, including those who worked alongside American forces and risked their own lives to keep Americans safe. I've been working with a group of about 50 Afghan women called the Female Tactical Platoon that was embedded with our cultural support teams and other units, and they've run into many problems in trying to secure their status here in the United States. The clock is ticking. If we don't secure their permanent legal status soon, not only will we have fallen short in our commitment to do what's right, but I fear it will be remembered by the next group of people we ask to help us. Can we count on your personal involvement, working with Congress and other parts of the administration to secure the legal status of our Afghan allies?
Yes, and I very much support the Afghan Adjustment Act. We need to do that.
Mr. Secretary, I want to turn now to fentanyl. Many people think of this as strictly a law enforcement issue, but as you know, there's an important diplomatic connection because our ability to fight the epidemic in our own country relies on our cooperation from other countries. Much of the chemicals used to make fentanyl that comes across our border originate in China. Cooperation on that issue with China began to deteriorate in 2019 under the previous administration, and it has continued on that path since. There have been challenges with Mexico as well. President López Obrador dropped all drug enforcement cooperation with the United States during the last administration, and he continues to be a difficult partner. Drug trafficking and the violence wrought by drug cartels is an important issue to me, not only as a member of this committee, but as a representative from Arizona, and I believe there's an important need for diplomatic efforts to see a meaningful impact. Mr. Secretary, how is the State Department using diplomatic pressure to regain Mexico and China's cooperation in stopping the flow of drugs?
With regard to Mexico, because this is at the very top of our agenda for all the reasons that we've already discussed in terms of the #1 threat that it poses to Americans, last year we agreed with Mexico to develop a joint synthetic drug action plan to expand cooperation with Mexico to deal with the problem of fentanyl production and transit from Mexico, bringing in not just law enforcement, which is obviously critical, but things like the health and trade and regulatory agencies, because when it comes to illegal legal precursors going to illicit use, it's important to bring them in as well. We've stood that up. We've seen in Mexico over the last year a record number of seizures when it comes to fentanyl. We've seen a record number of disruptions of the places where fentanyl is produced, but it also goes to the point that there is a sea of this stuff. And as you know very well, as members of the committee know very well, you can produce it in a room the size of the corner of this, this hearing room. So it's a massive effort, but the Mexicans are engaged in that because we have restored our diplomacy and engagement with them. They're putting more police resources into it as well. I mentioned earlier the importance of the technology that's being deployed to the ports of entry at the border, where 95% of the fentanyl is coming into the United States through those legal ports of entry. The technology that we have to screen for it is effective, and we need to get more of it out there as soon as possible. I know we're working on that. And then more broadly internationally, as I mentioned earlier, for the first time, I was able to get on the agenda of the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, including China, fentanyl and synthetic opioids as an issue that we need to work together. We'll be establishing a working group in the G20 on this. And in my own engagements with China, this has been very much at the top of the agenda. We need their cooperation one way or another on this. I hope that they will come to actually cooperating. If not, we'll have to look at other actions that we can take to elicit more cooperation, particularly when it comes to the diversion of licit precursors into illicit use.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Heisinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken over here. Before I get into my questioning, I am compelled to say something about Afghanistan. I actually represent one of those Marines who was injured at Abbey Gate. We owe these veterans and their families a deep explanation about what had happened there. I, too, agree that we have not satisfactorily, and this administration has not satisfactorily addressed that. I concur with what the chairman had said on that. Now I want to turn to the border. Lots of focus on the southern border. I want to talk about the northern border, and those of us from Michigan, the eastern border, quite frankly. The Great Lakes, recently myself and my Democrat colleague Brian Higgins led a number of colleagues in on a letter regarding the Great Lakes from the Great Lakes Task Force requesting President Biden urge his Canadian counterparts to increase their share of funding into a lot of the efforts that have gone into Great Lakes quality. There's a Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and a 1954 Convention on the Great Lakes fisheries, which obligate both Canada and the United States to provide funding for the Great Lakes. Fiscal year 2024, the United States has, through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, an authorized level of $425 million. By comparison, the government of Canada committed just $32.97 million, for just under $33 million between 2017 and 2022. Combined. So that's 5 years. They've done $33 billion. The letter is requesting that the president pursue this with his counterpart, Justin Trudeau. And I want to know if you have an expectation that the president will fulfill that request, and also I need to know about you and your commitment to doing that.
Yes and yes. And I can tell you that we've been discussing this with the Canadians, and your timing, Congressman, couldn't be better because, as you probably know, we're actually leaving this evening for Canada, and I can assure you that will be on the agenda.
Yep, I'm very aware. I actually happen to, I might be new to the committee, but I'm not new to the issues. I've been chair of the U.S.-Canada Interparliamentary Group for a number of terms now. I also want to, sticking to our friends of the North, but expand that a little bit, I want to talk about the Arctic and the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council came into being in 1996. It's the 8 countries that touch the Arctic Circle and above, U.S., Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark through Greenland, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. There is something in the Ottawa Declaration that states explicitly, quote, "The Arctic Council should not deal with matters related to military security," close quote. Yet, Russia's increased military presence and operations in the Arctic and responding actions by the militaries of other Arctic states are one source of competition and tension that has come to the Arctic. According to the BBC, Russia under Putin envisions a toll road of sorts to transit across the northern sea route that would transit goods and energy from Asia ports to ports in Europe. As part of that, he has militarized and nuclearized the Arctic to ensure his ships requiring access would have to rely on Russia's ice-breaking escort, and we've seen more aggressive military behavior by Russia in that area. Additionally, also according to the BBC, in February of 2023, Canada's military has said it discovered evidence of Chinese surveillance efforts in the Arctic. These were buoys that they believed China had dropped in there. Is it time to, one, re-examine what that partner agencies and those partners in the Arctic, those allies, how we interact with them? And then, as you know, after the Russian invasion, that the work was sort of paused. I'm wanting to know what the State Department and this administration plans to do to address those issues.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I actually took part in an Arctic Council meeting my first year on this job. We are committed to, and we have a strategy that we put out last October, which, if you haven't seen, I commend to you and happy to further discussion on that. Look, our goal, shared goal, is to do whatever we can with the other countries to try to preserve the Arctic as a peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative place. But if there are challenges to that, to its peaceful nature, obviously, we need to deal with them, and we're operating in a different environment.
Understandably, we have to dance a kabuki dance a bit with Russia because they are part of that Arctic Council. However, China has to be at the forefront of the discussion of what is happening in the Arctic as well. My time is expiring, but I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Chair recognizes Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your candor and your time and your knowledge of the issues. In your written statements, you talked about the growing conflicts, budget challenges, and great power competition. We have spent the last 3.5 hours, roughly 2.5 hours talking, 3.5 hours talking about the East and the West. And curiously missing is the North and the South dynamics. The world has changed greatly. Africans are 1/8 of the human race, and we spent less than 1% of our questions talking about our relationship going forward. Could you please share with us your thoughts that we may be missing on the importance of Africa in the New World?
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. In fact, I'm just back, as you may know, from Ethiopia and Niger, my third trip to sub-Saharan Africa. As Secretary, other colleagues, including the Vice President, who's almost quite literally on her way. And as you know, to reflect the importance of Africa, where in 20 years, I think we're going to have 1 in 4 people on this planet will be African. We put out a strategy for sub-Saharan Africa last year, and of course we had the Africa Leaders Summit, where the President convened and brought together the leaders of more than 40 countries. We've made significant commitments and joint plans coming out of that summit. We've named a very senior diplomat who was retired but is very well known, Johnny Carson, to oversee the implementation of the agreements and commitments that were made at the summit. And we are, in many ways, across many issue areas, really digging into building up and building out these partnerships. And that goes to a whole host of issues, some of them particularly urgent when it comes, for example, to food insecurity, where we're not only working to address immediate needs, the real focus that we're trying to bring to this, and this is what I've heard from African colleagues throughout, is the strong desire for investments in their own sustainable production capacity. And so we're engaging not only the government but the private sector in that. I think the potential is enormous in many parts of Africa, not only to be able to feed itself, but actually to feed other countries with sustainable production. We're digging into trade and investment. Obviously, we have some existing vehicles like AGOA. That's set to expire in 2025. I think it's had a dramatic positive impact on the ability of African countries to trade, including with the United States. And we'll look to work with Congress on that. At the same time, there's a free trade area of Africa that is now standing up. That's a hugely important thing because we've had this abnormal situation where, in the absence of these connections among African countries were doing more trade with countries outside of Africa than they were doing with each other. That will help right the balance and also create greater opportunities for investment from the United States because you'll have markets that are tied together. We're working on that with infrastructure, the infrastructure investments that we're making, including with the Global Partnership on Infrastructure Investment, many of whose projects will be focused in Africa, are going to do that and to connect countries together. We have the Millennium Challenge Corporation that's invested in, I think, very significant ways to help, again, African trade and investment move forward. As I said, in Ethiopia, we've had work there, but in Niger, one of the poorest countries in Africa. Actually, the MCC compacts are making a huge difference. For example, paving more than 300 kilometers of roads, working to connect Benin and Niger so that there is more of a common ability to trade and more of a common market between them. There's a lot to be said about this. I really welcome following up, particularly the work of the Africa Leaders Summit.
Yep, and two other parts to that is one is the 43 out of the 54 African leaders were in Russia this past week. And so when you talk about new alliances and competition for the new market, that they are actively seeking that relationship. But the last question I'd like to put on to you is that for the, well, it's probably just a statement that I think we lose credibility in the eyes of the world community when we let Haiti be so close and yet we're so far and distant from them, that to have the most powerful nation with the poorest nation right at our border, right at our footstool, that we are an ally of Haiti. They've been a creditor to us. They helped us in past wars in Savannah. I would like to know that we can unilaterally move in like we've done in other countries without a host of cooperation, but help Haiti gain their independence and truly cement their democracy.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Hill.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Grateful for your participation. I want to talk on Syria. It's the 12th anniversary of the start of the Syrian civil war. The crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by the Assad regime, Russia, and Iran are well known and indisputable. And I'm deeply concerned that the administration has not been even more robust in countering the creeping normalization in the diplomatic community to the Assad regime. Mr. Secretary, does the Biden administration support normalizing relations with Assad?
We do not.
Have you issued a démarche to those countries who you think are romancing diplomatic relations?
We have, and I have personally.
I'm concerned about UAE, Bahrain, Algeria, Oman, Egypt visited for the first time since 2011. So have they all been spoken to?
They have, including by me directly.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think this is very, very important. I think we send the wrong message. Let me stick on Syria as the topic and talk about H.R. 6265, the Captagon Act, which was included in last year's National Defense Authorization Committee. It requires an interagency strategy to be developed with the State Department in the lead to target, disrupt, degrade Assad's production and trafficking of Captagon. You're familiar with this?
I am, and in fact, we're working on that strategy and we'll submit a report on it.
Do you believe Syria meets the definition of being a major illicit drug-producing country or major drug transit country under the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961?
I'd need to come back to you on the exact definition, but what I can safely say is that the regime, Hezbollah, are clearly a threat to stability, public health, rule of law by way of the trafficking, notably of Captagon. So this is something we're deeply concerned about. I can't tell you without looking at it.
I understand that.
Whether it meets
Well, Senator Marshall and Representative Boyle and I wrote you last July about this, urging you to take a position on that. We never got an answer from you in writing, but we did get your answer in September when the President did not add Syria as a major drug-producing or drug transit country. I encourage that to be done this year. I think we are overwhelmed with Captagon poisoning people throughout the Gulf states. Another reason why I don't understand diplomatic relations by the Gulf with Syria. We have 150 examples of Captagon seizures in the region between between January 2022 and the date of our letter, and 200 more between January and the date of the presidential determination. I'd like to submit that letter, Mr. Chairman, for the record.
And also happy to come back to you on that, Congressman.
And without objection.
Thank you. And just recently, February 2023, in UAE, 4.5 million Captagon bills interdicted. So I think this is of concern. I hope you'll look forward to working with you on that strategy. When do you have a date when that strategy might be available?
I can't give you a date. I can tell you we're actively working on it, and we'll submit it, and I'll come back to your office with...
Come back to my office if you would, say between now and 1st of May, and let me know where you stand on that. That'd be very helpful.
Thank
and let me yield the gentleman, Mr. James, the balance of my time, and I yield to him.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Before I start, I want to thank the administration for extending humanitarian parole for Ukrainians. I have a large Ukrainian community in my district, and I applaud this. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First question. In 2016, the Obama administration recognized the genocide occurring against Iraqi Christians and other minorities. The Trump administration followed by fighting to preserve the full religious rights of all individuals, including Christians, to practice their culture and beliefs. I implore you, sir, to make sure that the Biden administration ensures that the rights and freedoms of Iraqi minorities are protected. will you raise, please, the issue of religious persecution of the Iraqi Christians with Prime Minister al-Sudani at your next available opportunity?
Yes, I will, and I could not agree with you more, and this is something that I was seized with, as you mentioned, the Obama administration's determination. This is something I worked on then, and we will absolutely keep a focus on.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for raising it.
Second question. As chair of the Africa Subcommittee, I believe that Africa has many, many opportunities, not just for people on the continent, but for the world, and particularly America. On the continent, however, the Chinese Communist Party is deploying exploitation and political influence campaigns to access key natural resources which threaten both our supply chains and national security. I am deeply concerned about the items particularly produced by slave labor in our supply chain. Would you, sir, be open to working with me on legislation to create a 21st century national strategy to strengthen our domestic industrial base and restore our critical minerals? 1, and 2, a bill to remove slavery from our supply chain, Mr. Secretary?
Yes and yes. We have a number of initiatives that are already moving forward. We happily both share that with you and listen to your thoughts, both certainly on the supply chain piece, and second, when it comes to slavery and modern slavery. We want to eliminate that whenever and wherever it is occurring. We'd welcome working with you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield.
The Secretary has to appear before the Appropriations Committee, and so
much less important than this.
Well, if you want to stay,
but nonetheless.
Okay. All right. Just thought I'd make the offer. So I apologize to the members that we did not get to, but you may submit your questions in writing for the Secretary, and he will respond. So pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, materials for the record. Without objection, committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Look forward to following up on this. Yes, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Where's our line?
I know, nonsense. Not surprising. No, Mike, and you know, Mike is terrific. And of course, his brother is trying desperately.